Carl Jung explained, 11 spiritual signs. Your spirit is awakening in silence. There's a transformation happening right now that no one is talking about. Not your spiritual teachers, not your therapists, not the wellness industry that profits from your perpetual seeking. It's happening in the last place modern culture wants you to look. In silence. In the absence of noise. In the fertile void where everything you've been taught to fear actually lives. And if you've been feeling it, this inexplicable pull toward quietness, this growing intolerance for the constant stimulation that everyone else seems to crave, this sense that something is trying to speak to you from beneath the noise of your life, you're not losing yourself. You're finding yourself. And what I'm about to share with you will validate an experience the external world has probably been dismissing, pathologizing, or trying to fix. Carl Jung understood something that mystics have known for millennia, something that modern psychology has largely forgotten, something that gets buried beneath the noise of self-help culture's constant demand for action, manifestation, and external transformation. He understood that the most profound spiritual awakening doesn't announce itself through dramatic visions or mystical experiences. It doesn't come with trumpets and burning bushes. It comes in whispers, in stillness, in the quiet dissolution of your need for noise. Listen to what Jung himself wrote. Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes. Read that again. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes. This isn't poetic metaphor. This is psychological precision. This is Jung telling us that everything we seek externally, validation, meaning, truth, God, the self, can only be found by turning inward. And that journey inward requires something our culture has declared war against: silence. Think about your life right now. From the moment you wake up, you're bombarded. Notifications, news, music, podcasts, television, conversations, the hum of technology, the buzz of thought, the endless internal narration of your own mind trying to make sense of a world that moves too fast for actual sense-making. We live in what could be called an assault of noise. Not just auditory noise, but informational noise, emotional noise, spiritual noise. And here's what most people don't realize. This noise isn't accidental. It's not just the byproduct of modern life. It's a defense system, a collective defense system against the one thing that threatens the structures of ego, culture, and control: interior silence. Because silence is dangerous, not to you, but to everything that profits from your distraction. Silence is where the persona begins to crack, where shadow material surfaces, where the unconscious speaks, where the self, that organizing center of your total psyche that Jung spent his entire life trying to help people contact, finally has the space to be heard. And modern culture knows this at some level. That's why every public space is filled with music, why we can't drive without podcasts, why we scroll through our phones the moment we have 30 seconds of unoccupied time. We've been conditioned to fear the very thing that would set us free. But something is changing in you, isn't it? Something you might not have words for yet. Maybe you've started waking up earlier than you need to, sitting in the pre-dawn darkness, feeling something you can't name. Maybe you've found yourself declining social invitations, preferring your own company in ways that feel both liberating and slightly terrifying. Maybe you've noticed that the television you used to leave on for background noise has become unbearable. Maybe you've started taking long walks alone, not because you're exercising, but because something in you is hungry for the space that silence creates. Or maybe it's shown up in stranger ways. You're in the middle of a crowded restaurant and suddenly the overlapping conversations feel like they're physically pressing on your chest. You're at a party where everyone is having a great time and all you can feel is an overwhelming need to leave, to be alone, to return to quiet. Your friends ask if you're okay, if you're depressed, if something's wrong. And you find yourself lying, making excuses, because how do you explain that nothing is wrong? How do you tell them that something is actually deeply right, that your spirit is pulling you towards something they can't see, that you're being called home to yourself, and the journey requires solitude they would interpret as isolation? This is what Jung called the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are beneath all the conditioning, the personas, the collective expectations. And for many people, this process begins not with a dramatic spiritual experience, but with a simple, mysterious shift. The noise becomes unbearable and the silence becomes irresistible. I want to tell you about someone I'll call Sarah. Sarah was a marketing executive, 42 years old. Extroverted, successful, always the life of the party. She had built her entire identity around being social, being connected, being the person everyone wanted to invite. Her calendar was always full. Her phone was always ringing. Her life was, by every external measure, exactly what she had worked for. And then something started happening around 3 in the morning. She'd wake up, not anxious, not needing to use the bathroom, not from a dream. Just wake up with an overwhelming compulsion to go downstairs, sit in the darkness of her living room, and be silent. The first few times she thought maybe she was developing insomnia. She tried going back to bed, but the pull was too strong. So she'd sit there, in the dark, in the quiet, feeling something she couldn't articulate. Not peace exactly, not anxiety exactly, something between, something that felt like listening even though there was nothing to hear. This went on for months, and gradually Sarah noticed something terrifying. Her personality was changing. The social events she used to love started feeling exhausting before they even began. Small talk became physically painful. She'd be in meetings at work, watching her colleagues perform their corporate personas, and she'd feel this wave of something, not judgment exactly, but a kind of transparent seeing that made participation in the performance impossible. Her friends started asking if she was okay. Her partner asked if she was depressed. And maybe the most disorienting part, Sarah started wondering if they were right, because everything she had identified as herself, the extroversion, the social energy, the constant engagement, was dissolving. Who was she if she wasn't that person? What was happening to her? What Sarah didn't know, what no one had told her because our culture doesn't have a framework for it, is that her spirit was awakening. Not in the way spiritual bypassing teaches, not in some transcendent escape from her humanness, but in the Jungian sense. Her psyche was beginning the work of differentiation from collective consciousness. Herself, that deeper organizing principle beneath ego consciousness, was calling her home, and it required silence to make contact. This is the journey we're about to explore together, these 11 signs that your spirit is awakening in silence, not the loud performative awakening that gets celebrated on social media, not the dramatic Kundalini experience or the ayahuasca journey or the near-death experience. The silent awakening, the one that happens in the dark hours of the morning, the one that pulls you away from the noise and into yourself, the one that modern psychology might label as depression or social anxiety or withdrawal, but that Jung would recognize as the psyche's intelligent movement toward wholeness. Here's what you need to understand before we go further. Your pull toward silence is not dysfunction. It's not something to fix. It's not you becoming antisocial or depressed or broken. It's your psyche creating the necessary conditions for transformation. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are requires first dismantling who you've been pretending to be. And that dismantling happens in silence, where the masks can finally come off because there's no one watching." Over the next 3 hours, we're going to explore the 11 specific signs that your awakening is happening beneath the noise. Signs you may have been experiencing but haven't had language for. Signs that, when recognized, will validate what you've known internally but doubted because the external world keeps telling you something is wrong. We'll explore why the noise has become unbearable, not because you're overstimulated, but because your spirit is reclaiming attention from the external world. We'll understand why solitude has shifted from something you tolerate to something you fiercely protect, not because you're avoiding relationship, but because the most important relationship, the one with your own psyche, is deepening. We'll examine why your dreams are becoming more vivid and demanding, not random firings of neurons, but the unconscious flooding consciousness with material that's been waiting for your attention. We'll discover why synchronicities multiply in the quiet spaces, meaningful coincidences that reveal you live in a far more interconnected reality than materialist consciousness allows. We'll explore why your body has started speaking louder than your mind, somatic intelligence bypassing mental knowing. With truth your thoughts cannot yet grasp. We'll understand why past wounds are surfacing now, not to torture you, but because you're finally strong enough to integrate what you previously could only repress. We'll examine why conventional spiritual practice is losing its appeal, not because you're becoming less spiritual, but because external forms are giving way to direct experience. We'll explore why creative expression has become urgent and non-negotiable, not hobby or entertainment, but the self painting itself into reality through your hands. We'll understand why you've become allergic to inauthenticity, not judgment, but your psyche demanding integrity. And we'll recognize the final 2 signs, that silence has become who you are, and that through the silence, the self is revealing itself. This isn't going to be easy material. Jung never promised easy. He promised real. He promised that if you're willing to descend into yourself, if you're willing to face what you find in the silence, if you're willing to undergo the death of who you thought you were, you might discover who you actually are. And that discovery, that meeting with the self, that individuation, it changes everything. So if you've been feeling this pull, if the noise has become unbearable, if you've been lying to friends about why you need to be alone, if you've been wondering if something is wrong with you because you'd rather sit in silence than scroll through your phone, if you've been terrified that you're losing your personality when actually you're finding your soul, this is for you. You're not broken, you're breaking open, and what's trying to emerge requires silence to be born. The world will tell you to turn up the volume. Your spirit is asking you to turn it down. Listen to your spirit, because in the silence, everything you've been seeking is already waiting, not out there, in here. And the journey to here, the journey home to yourself, begins the moment you stop running from the quiet and start listening to what it's trying to tell you. Let's begin. Before we explore the 11 signs themselves, we need to understand something fundamental. Why silence? Why does authentic spiritual awakening, what Jung called individuation, require this withdrawal from noise, this movement into interior space, this sometimes terrifying embrace of solitude and stillness? Why can't transformation happen in the noise? Why does your spirit choose silence as the vessel for awakening? The answer lies in understanding how consciousness itself operates. Jung discovered through his own descent into the unconscious, that harrowing period he called his confrontation with the unconscious, that the psyche has 2 distinct modes of operation. There's ego consciousness, which is outer-directed, language-based, socially constructed, and primarily concerned with adaptation to the external world. And then there's self-consciousness, which is inner-directed, symbolic, archetypal, and primarily concerned with the totality of who you are beyond social adaptation. Think of it this way. Ego consciousness is the part of you that speaks in words, thinks in linear sequences, operates in cause and effect, exists in time, and defines itself through its relationship to the external world. It's the I that has a job, a social role, a personality that others recognize. It's necessary. Jung never suggested we should eliminate the ego, but the ego is not the totality of who you are. It's the surface of a vast ocean, the visible tip of an enormous iceberg, the thin shell of consciousness floating on a sea of unconscious depths. Beneath ego consciousness lies everything the ego cannot directly access through language or linear thought. The personal unconscious, filled with repressed memories, rejected aspects of self, forgotten experiences, and the collective unconscious, containing the archetypal structures and patterns that all human psyches share. This is where the self resides, not the little self of ego, but the self with a capital S, what Jung called the archetype of wholeness and the God image within the psyche. Now here's what's crucial to understand. Ego consciousness and self-consciousness speak different languages. The ego speaks in words. The self speaks in symbols, images, sensations, intuitions, dreams, and that quiet knowing that arrives fully formed from somewhere beyond conscious thought. The ego operates through noise, internal narration, external conversation, conceptual thinking. The self operates through silence, the space between thoughts, the stillness beneath activity, the pregnant void where something is present without needing to announce itself through sound. Let me take you back to Sarah, the marketing executive we met in the opening chapter. When Sarah first started waking at 3 in the morning with that compulsion to sit in darkness and silence, her ego consciousness was terrified. It kept asking, "What's wrong with me? Why am I not sleeping? Why don't I want to be social anymore? Am I becoming depressed? Am I losing myself?" These are all ego questions, concerned with dysfunction, with returning to a previous state of adaptation, with maintaining the identity that has been constructed. But something deeper in Sarah, something she couldn't yet name, knew that nothing was wrong. In fact, something was finally becoming right. Herself, that organizing center of her total psyche, was beginning to make contact. And it required silence because the language it speaks cannot be heard through the noise of ego consciousness. Every time Sarah sat in that pre-dawn darkness, something was being communicated to her, not in words, not in thoughts, in presence, in sensation, in the gradual recognition that beneath her constructed personality, something vast had always been there, waiting. This is why silence is required for awakening, not because there's anything virtuous about being quiet, not because introverts are more spiritual than extroverts, not because withdrawal is the goal. Silence is required because it's the only environment in which self-consciousness can emerge into awareness without being immediately translated, interpreted, dismissed, or controlled by ego consciousness. Think about what happens in noise. Your ego is constantly processing, analyzing, categorizing, defending, maintaining your self-image, ensuring you fit in, protecting you from psychological threat. It's like a border guard that decides what gets into conscious awareness and what gets rejected. And the ego, by its nature, tends to reject anything that threatens its dominance, anything that suggests you are larger than the identity you've constructed, anything that whispers there's more to you than the roles you play. But in silence, real silence, not just absence of sound, but interior stillness, the ego's defenses begin to lower. The border guard gets tired, the constant surveillance relaxes, and through that relaxation, unconscious material begins to surface. First, it might be uncomfortable. Repressed emotions, shadow content, things you've been avoiding. This is why most people are terrified of silence. Not because silence is empty, but because they unconsciously know what will emerge from it. But if you stay with it, if you don't immediately fill the silence with distraction, something remarkable happens. Once the uncomfortable material surfaces and is acknowledged, once the shadow begins to integrate, once you've sat with what you've been avoiding, the deeper levels of the unconscious become accessible. And this is where the self resides. This is where the archetypes speak. This is where genuine transformation becomes possible. Jung wrote extensively about this in his later work. He said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." The pain he's referring to isn't primarily the pain of facing shadow material, though that's part of it. The pain is the pain of ego dissolution, the pain of discovering that who you thought you were is just a construct, that your carefully maintained personality is a mask, that everything you've identified with is not actually you. It's the death that must precede rebirth, and that death happens in silence. Let me share something personal here. Years ago, I went through what everyone around me interpreted as a breakdown. I had been working constantly, achieving, producing, maintaining this identity of someone who had their life together. And then quite suddenly, I couldn't do it anymore. I would sit at my desk, tasks in front of me, and feel nothing but a kind of interior paralysis. Not depression exactly, though I was certainly depressed. Something else. A complete inability to continue performing the role I had been playing. The people in my life were concerned. They suggested therapy, medication, vacation, anything to get me back to normal. But I made a decision that seemed crazy at the time. I chose to stay with the paralysis. I took time off work. I stopped forcing myself to be social. I sat in silence for hours every day, not because I wanted to, but because it was the only thing I could do. And I was terrified. Terrified that this was permanent, that I had somehow broken myself, that I would never be functional again. But after weeks of this, sitting in silence, feeling the terror, letting thoughts and emotions arise without trying to fix them, something shifted. I started having dreams of descending, of going down into dark places, and one morning I woke up with this clear knowing. I hadn't broken down. Something in me had broken through. The personality I had been maintaining, the persona that everyone recognized as me, had been a construction built to gain approval and avoid rejection. It wasn't me, and my psyche, in its wisdom, had stopped cooperating with the construction. What I discovered in that silence was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. I discovered shadow material I'd been repressing for decades, rage, grief, desires I'd labeled unacceptable. I discovered that beneath the competent, together persona was a scared child who had learned early that love was conditional on performance. And beneath that, deeper still, I discovered something that had no name, something that felt both intimately me and completely transpersonal, what Jung would call the self. That experience changed my relationship to silence permanently. I understood that silence wasn't absence, it was presence. It wasn't void, it was fullness. And the reason modern culture wages war against interiority, the reason we're surrounded by noise from the moment we wake until we collapse into exhausted sleep, is because a population that knows how to be silent is a population that cannot be controlled. A person who has descended into their own depths and met the self cannot be sold identities, cannot be manipulated through fear, cannot be convinced that their value lies in external achievement. This is why your spirit chooses silence, not to escape life, but to discover what life actually is beneath the noise of cultural conditioning, not to withdraw from the world, but to find out who you are before returning to the world as yourself rather than as the collection of roles and expectations others have projected onto you. Jung identified 5 specific reasons why silence is required for awakening, and I want to break these down for you because understanding them will help you trust the process you're in. First, ego dissolution. Constant external noise maintains ego dominance. As long as you're engaged with external stimulation, your ego consciousness remains in control, processing information, maintaining your self-image, defending your identity. But silence creates the conditions for ego dissolution, not destruction, but the temporary relaxation of ego's grip on consciousness. In that relaxation, you discover that consciousness itself doesn't require ego. Awareness continues when the ego steps back, and in that space, something larger can be known. Second, unconscious emergence. The unconscious, by definition, is what you're not conscious of. But it's not inert. It's alive, dynamic, constantly trying to make itself known. In noise, unconscious material gets drowned out, pushed down, kept at bay. In silence, it surfaces. This is why meditation practitioners often report that when they first begin sitting in silence, what arises is chaos, restless thoughts, uncomfortable emotions, old memories. This isn't failure, this is success. The unconscious is finally getting the space to empty itself into consciousness, which is the first step toward integration. Third, symbolic perception. Jung discovered that the unconscious, and particularly the deeper collective unconscious, speaks in symbols and images rather than concepts and words. Dreams, for instance, don't make logical sense because they're not meant to. They're symbolic communications that carry more meaning than language can hold. But to perceive symbolically, you need a different kind of attention than conceptual thinking requires. You need what we might call contemplative consciousness, the ability to simply be with an image or sensation without immediately translating it into concept. This mode of perception only develops in silence. Fourth, collective unconscious contact. Jung's most controversial but perhaps most important discovery was that beneath the personal unconscious lies a deeper layer he called the collective unconscious, the inherited archetypal structures that all human psyches share. This is where you find the great images, the wise old man, the divine child, the great mother, the shadow, the self. Contact with this level is what gives life its sense of meaning and connection to something greater than ego. But the collective unconscious doesn't speak English or any human language. It speaks in what Jung called archetypal images, and perceiving these requires the interior silence where symbolic consciousness can operate. Fifth, shadow integration. Perhaps most critically, silence is where shadow material, the aspects of yourself you've rejected, denied, or repressed, can finally be met and integrated. The shadow is everything you've decided is not me. Unacceptable desires, shameful feelings, rejected qualities. As long as you're distracted by external noise, shadow material stays repressed. But in silence, it surfaces. And while this can be deeply uncomfortable, it's also absolutely necessary. Jung said repeatedly that you cannot become whole by remaining only in the light. You must descend into darkness and reclaim what you've exiled to the shadows. This descent, this integration, this making conscious of the unconscious, this is the core of individuation. So when your spirit chooses silence, it's choosing the only environment where these 5 transformative processes can occur. Your psyche is creating the laboratory conditions for awakening. It's not random, it's not dysfunction, it's intelligence. But here's what you need to understand. Modern culture knows this, maybe not consciously, but at some level the structures of power and control know that interior silence is dangerous to their authority. A culture that produces truly individuated humans, people who know themselves deeply, who have integrated their shadows, who have made contact with the self, is a culture that cannot be manipulated through fear, cannot be sold false identities, cannot be controlled through projection of collective shadows. So we're surrounded by noise, constant stimulation, endless entertainment, social media algorithms designed to hijack attention, news cycles manufactured to produce anxiety, advertising that creates artificial needs. All of it, whether intentionally or not, serves to keep consciousness directed outward, to prevent the interior journey, to maintain ego dominance, to keep shadow material repressed, to block contact with the self. This is why when you begin experiencing this pull toward silence, toward solitude, toward withdrawal from constant stimulation, you'll likely encounter resistance, not just internal resistance from your own ego, but external resistance from the people around you. Friends will ask if you're okay. Partners will worry you're depressed. Colleagues will wonder if you're losing your edge. Society will pathologize your withdrawal, label it depression or social anxiety or avoidant attachment. But listen, the pathology isn't in the silence. The pathology is in a culture so terrified of interiority that it must fill every space with noise. The dysfunction isn't in your need for solitude. The dysfunction is in a society that can't tolerate being alone with itself, and therefore can't tolerate your choosing to be alone with yourself. Sarah, when she finally understood what was happening, when she stopped fighting the 3 a.m. call to darkness and silence, when she gave herself permission to honor what her psyche was asking for, her life didn't become smaller, it became more real. Yes, some friendships fell away. Yes, her career changed. Yes, she looked different to the people who had known her as the life of the odd party. But she stopped performing. She stopped exhausting herself maintaining a persona. And gradually, over time, she began to discover who she actually was beneath all that performance. She described it to me once like this. It felt like I'd been wearing a suit of armor my entire life, and I didn't even know I was wearing it because I'd put it on so young. But in the silence, I started to feel how heavy it was, how exhausting it had been to carry it. And piece by piece, in those early morning hours when no one was watching, I began taking it off. And underneath, I found someone I barely recognized, but somehow knew I'd been waiting my whole life to meet. This is what your spirit knows that your ego doesn't. You are not who you think you are. You are not the collection of roles, achievements, relationships, and identities that constitute your ego structure. Those things are real, they matter, they're part of your life, but they're not yourself. And the self, that organizing principle of wholeness, that God image within the psyche, cannot reveal itself through the noise of ego consciousness. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But you cannot become who you truly are if you don't first discover who you are not. And that discovery requires silence. It requires withdrawal of attention from the external world. It requires the courage to descend into yourself and face what you find there. Your spirit is choosing silence because that's where the real work happens, not the work of achieving, accumulating, or improving. Those are ego projects. The work of awakening, the work of making the unconscious conscious, the work of integrating shadow, the work of differentiating yourself from collective consciousness, the work of meeting the self. And this work, this individuation, this becoming who you actually are, Jung believed this was the fundamental task of the second half of life. In the first half, we build ego structures, we develop personas, we adapt to the world, we achieve, we acquire, we establish ourselves, all necessary. But at some point, and that point is different for everyone, the psyche begins demanding something else. It begins demanding truth, authenticity, wholeness. It begins calling you home to yourself. And that call sounds like silence becoming irresistible and noise becoming unbearable. So if you're in this process, if you're experiencing this pull, if you've been wondering why solitude suddenly feels like sanctuary, and why the life you built suddenly feels like a costume you're tired of wearing. Understand this: you're not becoming antisocial. You're becoming conscious. You're not avoiding life. You're preparing to live it authentically. You're not broken. You're breaking through. The silence is not your problem. The silence is your answer. And everything we're about to explore, these 11 signs, they're all variations of the same fundamental truth. Your spirit is creating the conditions for transformation. Your psyche is guiding you toward wholeness. Your self is calling you home. Listen to the silence, because in the silence, the self speaks, and what it has to say will change everything. Let's begin with the first sign, the one that often announces itself before you even recognize it, as spiritual awakening. The noise has become unbearable, not just annoying, not just overwhelming, unbearable, as in, you literally cannot bear it anymore. Something visceral happens in your body: tension, anxiety, even physical pain, when exposed to levels of noise and stimulation that you previously could tolerate or even enjoy. I want you to meet Marcus. Marcus is 37, works in tech, loves his job, has always considered himself a social guy who enjoys going out, being around people, having music playing while he works. He's never been someone who needed quiet. In fact, silence used to make him uncomfortable. He'd always have something on: podcast, music, television, just to fill the space. Then one evening, Marcus goes to his favorite restaurant with a group of friends. It's the same place they've been going to for years. Same noise level, same energy, same crowd. But this time, something is different. Within 10 minutes of sitting down, Marcus feels his chest tightening. The overlapping conversations around him, the music playing overhead, his friends talking and laughing, it all starts to feel like it's pressing on him. Not metaphorically pressing on him, physically pressing on him, like the sound has weight and it's crushing his chest. He tries to push through it, tries to participate in the conversation, but he can't focus on what anyone is saying because the noise is all he can perceive. Every laugh from a nearby table makes him flinch. Every clink of a glass feels like it's scraping the inside of his skull. After 20 minutes, he's sweating. His hands are shaking, and he has to leave. He makes an excuse about not feeling well, which is true, but not in the way his friends think. He goes home, sits in his dark, silent apartment, and starts to cry, not from sadness but from relief. The silence feels like water after days in the desert. Marcus doesn't understand what's happening to him. He thinks maybe he's developing some kind of sensory processing disorder, or maybe he's having panic attacks, or maybe, and this is what scares him most, he's losing his ability to function in normal social situations. What he doesn't know is that his psyche is doing something precise and intelligent. It's withdrawing energy from the external world and redirecting it inward. And this withdrawal announces itself first as noise intolerance. From a Jungian perspective, what's happening is this. The psyche has two primary directions of energy flow: extraversion, where energy moves toward external objects, people and experiences, and introversion, where energy moves toward internal images, reflections, and self-knowledge. For most of the first half of life, extraversion dominates. We're focused on adapting to the world, building relationships, achieving goals, establishing ourselves externally. But during the individuation process, during awakening, the psyche begins to reverse this flow. It withdraws libido, psychic energy, from external objects and redirects it toward the inner world. Jung called this the introversion of libido, and it's not optional. It's how the psyche creates the conditions for transformation. But this withdrawal doesn't happen comfortably. The first thing you notice is that everything external becomes more difficult to engage with, and noise is often the first casualty. Why noise specifically? Because noise is what maintains ego consciousness's dominance over your awareness. Think about what constant auditory stimulation does. It keeps you externally focused, keeps your attention directed outward, keeps your ego processing information, categorizing, analyzing, maintaining your constructed reality. Noise prevents interior silence, and interior silence is precisely what your psyche needs to begin revealing deeper layers of consciousness. So your spirit, in its wisdom, begins stripping away your tolerance for noise. It's not punishing you, it's clearing the channel. It's creating space for something that's trying to emerge. But from the ego's perspective, this feels like dysfunction. Your ego, which has been managing your external adaptation, starts to panic. What's wrong with us? Why can't we handle normal situations anymore? Are we broken? Let me break down the progression of noise intolerance that typically accompanies silent awakening. Stage 1. Mild irritation. You start noticing noise more. That background music in stores that you never paid attention to, now you notice it. The person talking loudly on their phone, you find it more annoying than you used to. Your tolerance for multiple conversations happening simultaneously decreases. You might start thinking you're just getting older or more irritable. Stage 2. Active avoidance. You begin structuring your life to minimize noise exposure. You start wearing earbuds even when you're not listening to anything, just to signal "don't talk to me." You choose quiet restaurants over loud ones. You avoid crowded places when you can. You find yourself leaving social situations earlier than you used to. You're still able to handle noise, but you're actively preferring not to. Stage 3. Physical symptoms. Noise exposure begins triggering physical responses: anxiety, chest tightness, headaches, overwhelming fatigue. This is your nervous system responding to what your psyche experiences as intrusion. The noise isn't just annoying anymore, it's triggering a stress response. Your body is telling you what your mind might not yet understand. This level of external stimulation is interfering with necessary internal processes. Stage 4. Aggressive protection. You find yourself getting angry about noise in ways that surprise you. Someone playing music loudly fills you with rage. A neighbor's dog barking becomes unbearable. You might start arguments about noise that you would have previously ignored. This isn't you becoming intolerant. This is your psyche fiercely protecting the silence it needs. Stage 5. Complete withdrawal. You systematically eliminate noise sources from your life. The television that used to be background comfort, gone. The music you used to play constantly, silence. The social events you used to attend, declined. You arrange your entire life around protecting access to quiet. And paradoxically, this is when you might start to feel most at peace, even though everyone around you thinks you're isolating. Marcus moved through all 5 stages over about 8 months, and each stage brought its own terror because he kept thinking something was wrong with him. His friends started asking if he was depressed. His girlfriend worried he was pulling away from her. His doctor suggested anxiety medication, but Marcus made a choice that changed everything. He decided to honor what his body was telling him instead of fighting it. He started saying no to loud venues. He explained to his girlfriend that he needed significant alone time, not because he didn't love her, but because something in him was demanding silence. He began taking walks in nature where the only sounds were wind and birds. And gradually, as he stopped forcing himself into noisy environments, something unexpected happened. The panic attacks stopped. The anxiety diminished. And in the silence, he started experiencing something he'd never felt before, a sense of coming home to himself. Here's what Jung understood that most therapeutic approaches miss. Your intolerance for noise is not something to medicate or therapy away. It's information. It's your psyche communicating that external stimulation is preventing internal transformation. The noise isn't just noise anymore, it's interference, it's static, It's the obstacles between your conscious mind and the deeper layers of self that are trying to make themselves known. Think about it this way. Imagine you're trying to hear someone speaking to you, but there's loud music playing. You can't make out what they're saying. Your only choice is to turn down the music or find somewhere quiet. That's what your psyche is doing, turning down the music of external life so you can finally hear the voice that's been trying to reach you all along. And what is that voice? It's not your thoughts. It's not your ego narrating your experience. It's something deeper. Jung would call it the self trying to make contact. Mystics might call it your soul. You might just experience it as a knowing that doesn't come from thinking, a sense of being guided that has no rational explanation, an interior presence that becomes undeniable once the noise of life stops drowning it out. But here's where it gets difficult. When you honor this need for quiet, when you start withdrawing from noisy environments and preferring silence, you will be judged by your culture, which pathologizes introversion as dysfunction, by your friends who interpret your withdrawal as rejection, by your own internalized beliefs about what normal, healthy behavior looks like. You'll be told you're isolating, avoiding, becoming antisocial. And you need to hear this clearly. They're wrong. Not wrong about their experience. If they're more comfortable in noise, that's legitimate for them. But wrong about your experience. Wrong about what your withdrawal means. Wrong about the idea that there's one correct way to be human, and it involves constant external engagement. I need to share something vulnerable here. When I went through my own noise intolerance phase, I lost friendships. Not because those people were bad friends, but because I simply couldn't participate in the activities that had bonded us. Concerts, bars, parties, these were the contexts where we connected. And when I couldn't tolerate those environments anymore, the friendships faded. Some of those people thought I had become judgmental, that I believed I was too good for those activities. Others thought I was depressed and they didn't know how to help. The truth was more mysterious and harder to explain. I was being pulled inward by something I couldn't name, and noise had become the enemy of that pull. I remember one particular night when a close friend confronted me. He said, "You've changed. You used to be fun. Now you're always making excuses, always needing to be alone, always leaving early. What's wrong with you?" And I didn't have an answer that would make sense to him. How could I explain that being in loud spaces felt like being assaulted? That small talk had become painful because I could feel myself performing a role rather than being authentic. That I was learning to hear something in the silence that I'd never known existed. And every time I exposed myself to noise, I lost the thread of that communication. So I didn't explain. I just said, "I don't know, I'm figuring it out." And I let the friendship fade because I couldn't be who he needed me to be anymore. It hurt. It still hurts. But I also know now that if I had forced myself back into those noisy environments, if I had medicated away the intolerance, if I had pushed through the discomfort to maintain those relationships, I would have lost something far more important. I would have lost the chance to meet myself. This is what Jung meant when he wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." The pain isn't just the pain of facing shadow material. It's the pain of losing the life you've built when it no longer fits who you're becoming. It's the pain of being misunderstood. It's the pain of choosing yourself when the world expects you to choose conformity. Now, let me share what Jung called the mirror effect, one of his most powerful psychological insights. What you judge in others is what you cannot face in yourself. And this works in reverse too. What others judge in you is what they cannot face in themselves. So when people around you judge your need for quiet, when they call you antisocial or say you're no fun anymore, they're actually revealing their own terror, their terror of silence, their terror of being alone with themselves, their terror of what they might discover if they stopped filling every moment with noise and distraction. Think about it. Why would someone be threatened by your choice to be quiet? If they're genuinely comfortable with themselves, your choices wouldn't bother them. But if they're using noise to avoid themselves, your ability to embrace silence becomes a mirror, showing them what they're running from. And that mirror is uncomfortable. So they try to fix you, pathologize you, convince you something is wrong, when really they're trying to avoid seeing what your transformation is revealing about their own avoidance. This doesn't make them bad people. It makes them human. We all do this. We all project onto others what we cannot face in ourselves. But understanding this dynamic helps you navigate the social consequences of noise intolerance with more compassion, for them and for yourself. Marcus eventually understood this. When his friends expressed concern about his withdrawal, he realized it wasn't really about him. It was about what his withdrawal triggered in them. They had built their identities around being social, around going out, around collective experiences defined by external stimulation. His choosing differently threatened that identity construction. It suggested there might be another way to live, and that possibility was destabilizing to their carefully maintained worldview. So Marcus learned to honor his needs, without apologizing for them, but also without judging his friends for not understanding. He found a smaller circle of people who could meet him where he was, and he accepted that some relationships were meant for certain chapters of life, not all chapters. But here's what I need you to understand about this first sign. The noise intolerance doesn't last forever in its most extreme form. What's happening is that your psyche is radically withdrawing from external stimulation to force interior attention. It's creating a crisis that cannot be ignored. But once you honor the withdrawal, once you create consistent space for silence, once you begin actually listening to what the silence is trying to reveal, the extreme sensitivity often moderates. You won't go back to your previous tolerance for noise. That channel has permanently shifted, but the panic response, the physical symptoms, the overwhelming need to escape, these often soften once your psyche knows you're listening. It's like the volume gets turned down on the external world once you've turned up the volume on the internal world. Marcus described it to me like this. At first, I felt like I was allergic to noise, like my body was physically rejecting it. But after about a year of really honoring the silence, of spending significant time alone, of learning to be still, something shifted. I could go to a restaurant again, I could be around people. But it was different. I wasn't using noise to distract myself anymore. I wasn't performing to fit in. I was just present, and the noise was just noise. It didn't threaten me because I wasn't running from myself anymore. This is the gift hidden inside the noise intolerance. It forces you to stop running. It strips away your ability to use external stimulation as anesthetic. It makes you face the silence you've been avoiding. And in that silence, you discover what you've been running from isn't actually threatening. It's liberating. Jung wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart." But you cannot look into your own heart when you're constantly looking outside yourself. The noise has to become unbearable so that the silence can become irresistible. It's not punishment, it's precision. Your psyche knows exactly what it's doing. So if you're experiencing this, if noise has become painful, if you're avoiding situations you used to enjoy, if you're feeling different from everyone around you, if you're wondering if something is wrong, let me tell you clearly, nothing is wrong. Something is becoming right. Your spirit is reclaiming your attention from the external world because something within you requires that attention. Something is ready to emerge. Something is trying to speak, and it needs silence to be heard. The world will tell you to push through, to medicate the sensitivity, to force yourself back into normal functioning. But I'm telling you, honor the intolerance. Protect the silence it's creating. Give your psyche what it's asking for. Because on the other side of this uncomfortable transition is a way of being you've never experienced, being at home in yourself, being genuinely present instead of performing, being guided by interior knowing instead of external noise. The noise became unbearable for a reason, not to isolate you, but to introduce you to the silence where your real life is waiting to begin. The second sign builds directly from the first. Once the noise becomes unbearable and you begin protecting silence, something profound shifts in your relationship to being alone. What used to feel like loneliness, that aching sense of disconnection, that feeling that something is missing when you're by yourself, transforms into something entirely different. Sanctuary. Being alone stops being something you tolerate or endure and becomes something you actively crave, something you protect fiercely, something that feels less like isolation and more like coming home. Let me introduce you to Jennifer. Jennifer is 41, has always been what she'd describe as a people person. Her identity was built around relationships, being a good friend, a present partner, an engaged colleague. Her calendar was always full. She prided herself on never saying no to social invitations. Being alone was something that occasionally happened between engagements, not something she sought out. Then something started changing. Jennifer began noticing that after social events, even ones she enjoyed, she felt drained in a way she never had before. Not just tired, actually depleted. She started needing more time alone to recover. Then she started preferring to be alone. Then she started actively choosing solitude over social engagement, which felt completely foreign to her identity. But here's what made it confusing. Jennifer started lying about it. When friends would invite her out, she'd make excuses. I'm swamped with work. I'm not feeling well. I have family obligations. She couldn't bring herself to tell the truth, which was simply, I'd rather be alone. Because even to her, that sounded wrong. It sounded antisocial. It sounded like she didn't value her friendships. It sounded like something was wrong with her. The guilt was intense. She'd be home on a Friday night, alone by choice, enjoying the solitude, and simultaneously feeling guilty for enjoying it. Shouldn't she want to be with people? Isn't connection what life is about? Aren't humans social creatures? What kind of person actually prefers their own company to friends who care about them? This internal conflict is what almost everyone experiences during this shift, and it's rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding that Jung worked his entire life to correct: the conflation of loneliness with solitude. In modern culture, these two things are treated as the same. Being alone equals being lonely. But Jung discovered they're not just different, they're actually opposite experiences. Loneliness is the painful feeling of being disconnected from yourself and others. It's what happens when you're not in authentic relationship, either with your own inner world or with the external world. You can be desperately lonely in a room full of people if you're not actually present, not actually connecting, not actually being yourself. And this is the key. Most people's loneliness isn't actually about being alone. It's about being disconnected from their own depths while they're with others. Solitude, on the other hand, is communion with yourself. It's the state of being alone in a way that allows genuine relationship with your own psyche, your own depths, your own soul. And far from being lonely, solitude is where the most profound intimacy happens. Intimacy with yourself. Jung wrote something that completely reframes this. Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. Think about that. The loneliest you've ever been was probably not when you were physically alone. It was when you were with people, but couldn't share what was actually real for you. When you had to perform. When you had to hide parts of yourself. When you felt unseen. That's loneliness. And paradoxically, solitude is the cure for it. because in solitude you finally get to be with someone who can hear everything you need to communicate, yourself. Jennifer's transformation from loneliness to sanctuary happened in stages, and I want to break these down because you might recognize yourself somewhere in this progression. Stage 1, loneliness. This is where most people begin, experiencing being alone as painful, as something to avoid, as evidence that something is wrong. In this stage, you fill time when you're alone with distractions, television, social media, phone calls, anything to avoid the discomfort of your own company. Stage 2, tolerance. You begin to tolerate being alone. You can do it without constant distraction. You might even notice that it's not as terrible as you thought, but you're still not choosing it. You're just accepting it when circumstances require it. Stage 3, preference. This is where the shift starts to become noticeable. You find yourself sometimes preferring to be alone rather than social. Not always, but sometimes. You might turn down invitations occasionally because you genuinely want time to yourself. This is when the guilt usually begins, because wanting to be alone still feels like something is wrong. Stage 4, craving. Now you're actively seeking alone time. You need it. You feel off balance when you don't get it. You start structuring your life to protect pockets of solitude. This is when other people start noticing and asking if you're okay. The external judgment intensifies, which compounds the internal guilt. Stage 5, sanctuary. This is the transformation point. Solitude stops being just something you want and becomes a sacred space. It's where you feel most yourself, where you can breathe, where you restore, where your deepest work happens. Being alone shifts from preference to necessity, not pathological necessity, but spiritual necessity. Stage 6, fierce protection. In this stage, you guard your solitude the way you'd guard your most precious resource, because it is your most precious resource. You get angry when it's intruded upon. You're willing to disappoint others to maintain it. You've stopped apologizing for needing it. The guilt has transformed into clarity. This isn't selfish, this is self-honoring. Jennifer moved through these stages over about 18 months, and each stage brought its own challenges, particularly in relationships. Her partner felt rejected. Her friends felt abandoned. Her family wondered if she was depressed. But Jennifer kept honoring what felt true, even when she couldn't explain it. She started blocking off entire weekends for herself. She'd turn off her phone, be completely unreachable, and spend the time reading, writing in her journal, taking long walks, or simply sitting in silence. And in that protected solitude, something remarkable began to happen. She started meeting herself. She discovered that beneath the persona of people person, there was someone who actually found small talk exhausting and deep conversation energizing. She discovered creativity she didn't know she had. She started painting, something she hadn't done since childhood. She discovered that many of her friendships had been based on habit and performance, rather than genuine connection. She discovered grief she'd never processed, joy she'd been too busy to feel, desires she'd been too distracted to acknowledge. Most importantly, she discovered that she had been seeking externally what could only be found internally: validation, meaning, a sense of being seen and understood. She'd been looking for other people to tell her who she was, to reflect her value, to make her feel real. But in solitude, she realized she could do this for herself. She could see herself. She could validate her own experience. She could be the witness to her own life. This is what Jung meant by the introversion of libido during individuation. The psychic energy that was directed toward external objects and relationships gets withdrawn and redirected toward the inner world. It's not that external relationships become unimportant, but they can't be the source of your sense of self anymore. That has to come from within, and discovering that requires solitude. From a Jungian perspective, what happens in protected solitude is profound. Shadow material surfaces. When you're alone, without the distraction of social performance, the parts of yourself you've been repressing start to emerge. The anger you've been nicing away, the grief you've been staying busy to avoid, the desires you've labeled inappropriate. In solitude, there's no one to hide from, which means these exiled parts of self can finally be acknowledged. Creative impulses emerge. The unconscious speaks in images, symbols, impulses to create, but these get drowned out by external noise and social engagement. In solitude, they can finally be heard. This is why so many people discover unexpected creativity during periods of alone time. They're finally quiet enough to hear what wants to be expressed. Intuitive knowing clarifies. Intuition is immediate knowing that arrives without logical process, but it's a quiet voice, easily overridden by rational thought and external input. In solitude, intuitive knowing has space to make itself heard. You start knowing things you can't explain how you know. The self reveals its nature. This is the deepest gift of solitude. The self, that organizing center of the total psyche, what Jung called the God image within, can only reveal itself when ego consciousness relaxes its dominance, and ego relaxes most completely in solitude, where there's no external demand for performance or adaptation. Healing occurs without external interference. The psyche has its own healing intelligence, but that intelligence gets interrupted by constant external engagement. In solitude, natural healing processes can operate. Old wounds can be felt, processed, integrated. This doesn't mean you don't need therapy or support, but it means some healing work can only happen when you're alone with yourself. Jennifer described her sanctuary time like this. It's like I'm in a cocoon. And I know that sounds cliché, the whole butterfly metaphor, but that's what it feels like. Something is transforming in me, and it can only happen in this protected space where no one is watching. No one is asking me to be anything. No one needs me to perform. When I'm alone, I can finally stop pretending. And it turns out, underneath all the pretending, there's someone I actually really like. But let's talk about the cost, because there is a cost. Relationships built on frequency of contact rather than depth of connection will be tested by this shift. If your friendships are based on always being available, always saying yes, always showing up, those friendships will struggle when you start protecting solitude. Some relationships will adapt. The ones that are based on genuine mutual recognition, on seeing each other truly, will survive this transition. They might look different. Less frequent contact, but deeper when you do connect. But some relationships will end. And this is where it gets painful. Jennifer lost friendships during her sanctuary phase. Not dramatically, not with fights or conflict, but through slow fading. People who used to text daily stopped reaching out. Invitations slowed down and then stopped coming. Some friends explicitly told her she'd changed, and they didn't understand her anymore. And Jennifer had to grieve those losses, while simultaneously honoring that her need for solitude was non-negotiable. This is where Jung's concept of the mirror effect becomes crucial again. When people in your life judge your need for solitude, when they interpret your withdrawal as rejection, when they pathologize your choosing alone time as isolation, they're revealing their own relationship with solitude. Specifically, they're revealing their terror of being alone with themselves. Someone who is comfortable with themselves doesn't feel threatened by your solitude. They might miss you, might wish they could see you more, but they don't interpret your choices as statements about them. But someone who uses constant social engagement to avoid themselves, your choosing differently feels like an indictment of their avoidance. Your sanctuary reveals their lack of one, and that's uncomfortable. I want to share something vulnerable about my own solitude transformation. When I went through this shift, my partner at the time couldn't understand it. We'd built our relationship on constant togetherness. We lived together, worked near each other, spent most evenings together, traveled together. Then I started needing significant time alone. Not occasionally, but regularly. Days, sometimes weekends, where I needed to be completely alone. She experienced this as rejection. No matter how many times I explained that it wasn't about her, that I loved her, that I just needed this internal space, she couldn't stop taking it personally, because from her perspective, if I loved her, I'd want to be with her. The idea that I could love her and also need significant time away from her didn't compute. Eventually, we ended the relationship, not because either of us was wrong, but because we'd fundamentally different needs for solitude and togetherness, and neither of us was willing to betray ourselves. It was one of the most painful experiences of my life, and I had moments, many moments, where I wondered if I was making a mistake, if my need for solitude was actually just avoidance, if I was destroying something good because of some selfish need for alone time. But then I'd spend time in solitude and I'd remember, this isn't selfish, this is how I access myself. This is where I hear the quiet voice of interior guidance. This is where I process my life instead of just living it. This is where I meet the depths of myself. And without this, I'm not actually present in relationship anyway. I'm performing presence while being internally absent. That relationship ended, but the choice to honor my need for sanctuary was the beginning of understanding what authentic relationship requires. Two people who know themselves separately before they try to know each other together. You cannot truly connect with another if you haven't connected with yourself. And connecting with yourself requires solitude. Jung wrote about this extensively in his work on Individuation. He said that individuation, becoming truly yourself, is necessarily a solitary process. Not because relationship isn't important, but because the work of differentiating yourself from collective consciousness, integrating shadow, making the unconscious conscious, meeting the self. This work happens in interior space that no one else can access. This doesn't mean you become a hermit. It doesn't mean relationship becomes unimportant. But it does mean the foundation of your life shifts from external connection to internal connection. And from that internal foundation, external relationships become richer, more authentic, more real, because you're bringing your actual self to them, not a performed version designed to gain approval. Jennifer eventually found a new circle of friends, smaller but deeper, people who understood the need for solitude because they felt it themselves. People who could go weeks without contact and then pick up conversation as if no time had passed. People whose friendships weren't based on constant availability, but on mutual recognition of depth. And she found that her capacity for genuine intimacy increased. When she did engage with people, she was actually present. She wasn't performing or maintaining an image. She wasn't exhausted from social obligation. She was choosing to be there, and that choice made all the difference. Her relationships became less frequent, but infinitely more meaningful. The shift from loneliness to sanctuary is one of the most profound transformations of silent awakening. It's the recognition that the most important relationship you'll ever have is the one with yourself. And that relationship requires time, space, solitude, sanctuary. It requires that you stop running from yourself long enough to actually meet yourself. The world tells you that being alone is sad, that it means something is wrong, that healthy people are constantly social. But Jung knew differently. He knew that the journey to wholeness is necessarily a lonely one, not because you end up alone, but because you must first learn to be alone with yourself before you can be truly together with anyone else. So if you're experiencing this shift, if solitude is becoming sanctuary, If you're choosing alone time over social engagement, if you're lying to friends about why you need to be by yourself, because the truth sounds too strange, understand this. You're not becoming antisocial. You're becoming intimate with yourself. You're not avoiding relationship. You're finally entering into the most important relationship of your life. The sanctuary you're creating in solitude isn't isolation. It's the cocoon where your actual self is being born. And that self, once it emerges, will be capable of connection the performing self never was. Because it will be real, it will be whole, it will be you. Protect your sanctuary, honor your solitude, stop apologizing for needing time alone. This isn't selfish. This is how you find yourself. And that self is what you've been seeking all along. The third sign moves us from external changes, noise, intolerance, preference for solitude, into the realm that Jung considered the royal road to the unconscious, dreams. And not just any dreams, but dreams that are unusually vivid, emotionally intense, recurring, or that linger in consciousness long after waking. Dreams that feel less like random neural firing and more like messages demanding your attention. Let me tell you about Thomas. Thomas is 34, works in finance, has always been someone who doesn't remember his dreams. He'd wake up knowing he'd dreamed something, but within minutes any memory of it would be gone. This had been his pattern his entire adult life, and he never thought much about it. Dreams were just dreams, meaningless products of the brain sorting information while asleep. Then, about 6 months into his silent awakening, after the noise had become unbearable, after he'd started craving solitude, Thomas started having a recurring dream. Same dream, night after night, sometimes multiple times in one night. In the dream, he's standing at the top of a spiral staircase that descends into darkness. He knows he needs to go down, but he's terrified. Sometimes he starts descending and wakes up in panic. Sometimes he just stands at the top, frozen. Sometimes he can hear voices coming from below, but he can't make out what they're saying. The dream woke him with his heart racing, and unlike every other dream he'd had in his adult life, this one didn't fade. It stayed with him. All day at work, he'd see that spiral staircase. In meetings, he'd find himself thinking about the darkness below. At night, he'd lie awake dreading sleep because he knew the dream was waiting. Thomas didn't know what to do with this. He mentioned it to friends who offered dream dictionary interpretations. Stairs going down means you're depressed. Darkness represents fear of the unknown. These explanations felt hollow. They missed something essential about the dream's quality. It didn't feel like a symbol to be decoded. It felt like something alive, something trying to communicate, something demanding response. What Thomas was experiencing is what happens during silent awakening when the channel between conscious and unconscious opens. The unconscious becomes dramatically more communicative, and dreams are its primary language. Jung spent decades studying dreams. His entire psychology emerged from taking dreams seriously, not as random images to be interpreted through fixed symbols, but as living communications from the unconscious parts of the psyche. He wrote, "The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul." Think about what that means. Dreams aren't meaningless. They're not just the brain processing information. They're doors, access points to layers of yourself that waking consciousness cannot reach. And during silent awakening, those doors don't just open a crack, they swing wide. Here's what's happening psychologically. In your normal waking state, ego consciousness dominates. It's managing your external adaptation, maintaining your persona, defending against threats to your self-image, processing information through rational thought. The unconscious is active, but its communications get filtered, dismissed, or ignored because ego consciousness is running the show. But during silent awakening, two things happen simultaneously. First, ego consciousness begins to relax its dominance. Remember, you're withdrawing from external engagement, spending time in silence and solitude, which naturally quiets the ego's constant activity. Second, the unconscious senses this opening and begins pushing material toward consciousness. It has things to say, material to process, wisdom to share, shadow to integrate, and dreams are how it speaks. Let me break down the progression of dream intensification that typically accompanies silent awakening. Stage 1. Forgettable dreams. This is where most people exist most of the time. You know you dreamed, but you can't remember details. The unconscious is relatively quiet, or more accurately, ego consciousness is so dominant that unconscious communications can't break through to memory. Stage 2. Occasional recall. The channel is opening. Some dreams start sticking. You might wake up with a vivid image or feeling that lasts for an hour or two. This is the unconscious testing whether you're listening. Stage 3. Vivid dreams. Now you're remembering entire dream narratives. The images are clear. The emotions are strong. The dream logic makes sense within the dream, even if it's bizarre by waking standards. The messages are getting louder. Stage 4. Recurring symbols. Certain images, scenarios, or themes start repeating. You might dream of water repeatedly, or being in your childhood home, or being chased, or discovering new rooms in familiar houses. These recurring elements are the unconscious saying, "Pay attention to this. This is important." Stage 5. Numinous dreams. Now you're having dreams that feel qualitatively different. Jung called these big dreams or numinous dreams, dreams that carry an overwhelming sense of significance, that feel sacred or luminous, that feature archetypal figures like wise old men, divine children, or transpersonal symbols. These are communications not just from your personal unconscious, but from the deeper collective unconscious. Stage 6. Transformative dreams. These are dreams that change you. You wake from them knowing something has shifted. Your perspective has changed. A problem has been resolved. A truth has been revealed. These dreams are initiatory experiences. They mark transitions in your individuation process. Thomas's recurring staircase dream was hovering between stages 4 and 5. The repetition indicated importance. The numinous quality, that sense of sacred terror, indicated archetypal dimension. And his psyche, in its wisdom, kept presenting the same image night after night because he wasn't responding to it. Finally, after weeks of this dream tormenting him, Thomas did something that changed everything. He started engaging with the dream instead of just experiencing it. He began practicing what Jung called active imagination, a technique of consciously dialoguing with unconscious material. Thomas would sit in silence during the day, close his eyes, visualize the spiral staircase from his dream, and imagine descending it. Not just visualizing passively, but actively engaging. He'd ask out loud, "What's down there? What are you trying to show me?" And he'd wait in silence to see what arose. The first few times, nothing happened, or rather nothing his ego could recognize. Just discomfort, resistance, fear. But he kept sitting with it, and gradually, images started coming. Memories from childhood, emotions he'd been repressing, aspects of himself he'd rejected. The darkness at the bottom of the stairs wasn't empty. It was full of everything he'd been avoiding by staying at the surface of consciousness. Over several months, Thomas engaged with this dream through active imagination. He symbolically descended the stairs, met what was waiting in the darkness, and began the work of integrating it. And as he did this inner work, the dream changed. Eventually, he was able to descend all the way. What he found at the bottom wasn't what he'd feared. It was a kind of sanctuary, a private inner space where he could access wisdom and knowing that his waking consciousness couldn't reach. Once he'd completed this symbolic descent in active imagination, the dream stopped recurring. His unconscious had delivered its message, Thomas had received it and responded, and the communication was complete. This is how dreams function during silent awakening. They're not random, not meaningless, not just stress processing. They're precise communications from the parts of yourself that ego consciousness cannot access, and they intensify during awakening because the unconscious finally has your attention. Jung identified specific types of dream imagery that commonly appear during individuation, and I want to share these because you might recognize them from your own dreams. Descending imagery, dreams of going down, stairs, elevators, caves, underwater, almost always represent descent into the unconscious. Thomas's staircase is a classic example. These dreams are invitations. Your psyche is asking you to go deeper, to explore below the surface of ego consciousness. Water dreams. Jung saw water as a primary symbol of the unconscious itself. Dreams of oceans, rivers, floods, or being underwater often indicate engagement with unconscious material. Drowning dreams might represent being overwhelmed by unconscious content. Swimming easily might indicate growing comfort with unconscious exploration. Shadow figures, dreams where you're being chased, where threatening figures appear, where you encounter someone dark or frightening. These often represent shadow material, the rejected or repressed aspects of yourself. Jung taught that the shadow appears threatening in dreams until you turn and face it, at which point it often transforms. Wise old man or woman. Dreams featuring teachers, guides, mysterious strangers who offer wisdom or direction. These often represent the self, trying to guide ego consciousness. These figures speak with authority that transcends ego understanding. Death or transformation dreams. Dreams of dying or of others dying usually don't predict actual death. They represent ego death, the death of old identity structures, old ways of being, outdated self-concepts. These are transformation dreams. Something is dying so something else can be born. Childhood home dreams. Dreams that take place in childhood locations often indicate engagement with early material. Developmental wounds, family patterns, formative experiences. The unconscious returns you to these spaces to process what happened there. Discovery dreams. Dreams where you find new rooms in familiar houses or discover hidden passages or unexpectedly end up in unknown places. These represent discovering new aspects of yourself, accessing previously unconscious potential. The key to working with dreams during silent awakening isn't interpretation through dream dictionaries. Jung was emphatic about this. A dream symbol doesn't have fixed meaning. Water doesn't mean emotion for everyone in every context. Dream symbols are living, personal communications that must be understood in relation to your specific psyche, your life situation, your individual journey. Instead of interpretation, Jung advocated for relationship. Engage with dream images as if they're alive, because in a sense they are. They're living aspects of your psyche presenting themselves to consciousness. Talk to them. Ask them what they want. Let them respond. This is active imagination, and it's one of the most powerful tools for making the unconscious conscious. Let me share my own transformative dream from this period of my life. I've never shared this publicly, but it's relevant here. I dreamed I was in a vast library, shelves reaching impossibly high, filled with books. An old woman appeared, ancient, weathered, with eyes that seemed to contain centuries. She handed me a book and said, "This is your book. You've been writing it your whole life without knowing." I opened it and saw that every page contained moments from my life, but annotated with meanings I'd never seen. Conversations I thought were mundane were actually pivotal. People I'd dismissed were actually teachers. Pain I'd experienced was actually initiation. I woke from this dream in tears. Not sad tears, tears of recognition. The dream was showing me that my life wasn't random chaos I'd been struggling through. It was a story with meaning, with purpose, with design. And the old woman, clearly a representation of the self, the wise aspect of my own psyche, was showing me that I could read my life differently. I could see the symbolic, meaningful layer beneath the literal. That dream changed how I related to my own experience. It initiated a shift from seeing myself as victim of circumstance to seeing myself as participant in a meaningful journey. And that shift didn't come from someone interpreting the dream for me. It came from sitting with the dream, feeling its weight, letting it work on me. This is what dreams do during silent awakening. They work on you, they change you. They reveal dimensions of your experience you couldn't see from ego consciousness alone. And the more you honor them, the more you engage with them, the more your psyche will communicate through them. Practically, here's what I recommend if you're in this phase of dream intensification. Keep a dream journal. Write dreams immediately upon waking, before you've fully re-entered waking consciousness. Don't worry about making sense of them. Just record what you remember, images, feelings, fragments. Look for patterns over time. Individual dreams might seem random, but patterns across multiple dreams reveal what your unconscious is working on. Are you repeatedly in water, in childhood homes, being chased? These patterns matter. Practice active imagination. Take troubling or recurring dream images and engage with them consciously. Close your eyes, bring the image to mind, and dialogue with it. Ask what it wants to show you. This technique bridges conscious and unconscious. Don't force interpretation. Let dreams sit with you. Let them work on you over time. Sometimes understanding comes weeks or months after the dream. The ego wants immediate answers, but dreams operate on different timescales. Pay attention to feeling tone. Sometimes the emotion of a dream is more important than its content. A dream that leaves you feeling awe or terror or grief, that feeling is data about what the unconscious is processing. Share selectively. Not all dreams need to be shared, and sharing with people who dismiss dreams as meaningless can diminish their power. But sharing with someone who takes dreams seriously can help you see layers you might miss alone. Jung wrote something profound about the relationship between dreams and consciousness. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. Notice the paradox there. Dreams are what happen when you're looking outside, seeking meaning externally, living unconsciously. But when you look inside, when you take dreams seriously, when you engage with them, when you let them guide you toward deeper self-knowledge, you wake up. Dreams become the vehicle of awakening. Thomas eventually understood that his recurring staircase dream wasn't tormenting him. It was initiating him. It was asking him to descend into the depths of himself, to stop living only on the surface of consciousness, to access the wisdom and wholeness that lived in the darkness he'd been afraid to explore. Once he accepted the invitation, once he made the descent, his entire relationship with himself shifted. He described it like this: "Before, I thought I was just my thoughts, my job, my daily activities. The dream showed me I was so much more. There were entire rooms of myself I'd never visited, entire dimensions of experience I'd never accessed. The staircase was showing me the way down, into my own depths. And yeah, it was scary. Descending into yourself is scary because you don't know what you'll find. But what I found was everything. Everything I'd been seeking outside myself was already there, waiting in the darkness I'd been afraid of." Now let's talk about the mirror effect with dreams. If you're someone who dismisses dreams as just dreams, if you think they're meaningless or not worth attention, if you feel superior to people who read too much into their dreams, you're revealing something about yourself. You're revealing your fear of the unconscious, your fear of what might surface if you gave those images and symbols permission to speak. Because taking dreams seriously means admitting that your ego consciousness isn't in total control. It means acknowledging that there are aspects of yourself operating beneath awareness, communicating in languages your rational mind can't fully grasp. It means accepting that you're not just who you think you are, you're also who you dream you are and who dreams you. This is threatening to ego consciousness. The ego wants to believe it's running the show, that it knows what's going on, that consciousness is all there is. Dreams shatter that illusion. They prove that consciousness is just the visible layer of something much deeper and more mysterious. So people dismiss dreams. They call them meaningless. They refuse to engage with them, not because dreams actually are meaningless, but because taking them seriously would require acknowledging the unconscious, and acknowledging the unconscious would require changing how they relate to themselves. But during silent awakening, you can't maintain that dismissal. The dreams become too vivid, too persistent, too obviously meaningful. They demand response. And once you begin responding, once you start taking them seriously, once you let them guide you into your own depths, your relationship with yourself fundamentally changes. You realize you're in constant conversation with yourself at levels you previously didn't acknowledge. You realize your psyche is far more intelligent than your ego. You realize that guidance, wisdom, and transformation don't have to come from external teachers or practices. They're built into the architecture of your own consciousness, communicating every night through dreams. Jung believed that dreams were the most reliable source of spiritual guidance available to humans, not because they're mystical or supernatural, but because they're communications from the self, that organizing center of the total psyche that knows far more than ego consciousness can access. Dreams are the self's way of correcting ego's misperceptions, guiding the individuation process, revealing shadow material, and initiating transformation. This is why dreams intensify during silent awakening. The self is taking advantage of the opening you're creating through noise, intolerance, and solitude. It's flooding consciousness with material that needs to be integrated, wisdom that needs to be heard, transformation that needs to occur. Your job isn't to interpret every symbol or understand every image. Your job is to listen, to engage, to let the dreams work on you. Thomas told me something months after his staircase dream finally resolved. The dreams haven't stopped. They're still vivid, still meaningful, but I'm not scared of them anymore. I actually look forward to sleep now because I know I'm going to learn something. The dreams are like meetings with a part of myself that's wiser than my waking self. They show me things I need to see, warn me about patterns I'm repeating, guide me toward what's next. I don't always understand them immediately, but I trust them now. They've never been wrong. This trust in the unconscious, this shift from treating dreams as meaningless to treating them as guidance, is one of the defining features of silent awakening. You stop looking outside yourself for direction. You stop consulting endless external authorities. You turn inward and you discover that the most reliable guidance has been speaking to you every night, waiting for you to finally listen. Jung wrote near the end of his life, "The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul, opening into that cosmic night which was Psyche long before there was any ego consciousness, and which will remain Psyche no matter how far our ego consciousness may extend." Read that again. The dream is a door into the cosmic night that existed before ego and will exist after ego. Your dreams connect you to something eternal in yourself, something that transcends your temporal personality, something that participated in human psyche long before you were born and will continue after you die. This is the collective unconscious speaking through your individual dreams. When you honor your dreams, when you engage with them seriously, when you let them guide your awakening, you're not just learning about yourself. You're connecting to the depths of the human psyche itself. You're accessing wisdom that doesn't belong to you personally, but flows through you. You're participating in the eternal conversation between consciousness and the unconscious that has been happening since humans first closed their eyes and dreamed. So if your dreams are becoming more vivid, if they're recurring, if they're leaving you with a sense of meaning you can't quite articulate, if they're demanding your attention in ways that feel uncomfortable or unfamiliar, don't dismiss them. Don't pathologize them as stress or anxiety or meaningless neural noise. Listen to them. Write them down. Sit with them. Ask them what they want to show you. Let them work on you, because your unconscious is speaking, and it has been waiting your entire life for you to finally pay attention. The dreams aren't disturbing you, they're awakening you, and the wisdom they carry is precisely what you need for the journey ahead. The fourth sign moves us from the internal world of dreams into something that challenges our entire understanding of reality itself. Synchronicity. Meaningful coincidences that cluster specifically during or after periods of silence, solitude, or stillness, as if the silence creates conditions for reality itself to respond. Let me introduce you to Elena. Elena is 36, an architect, pragmatic by nature and training. She's someone who has always trusted logic, cause and effect, material explanation. She's never been particularly spiritual, never believed in signs or fate or anything that couldn't be measured or proven. When she began experiencing noise intolerance and craving solitude, she approached it scientifically. Probably stress, maybe burnout, something to manage and solve. Then something started happening that her rational mind couldn't explain. Every time she spent significant time in meditation or walking alone in nature, activities she'd recently started because they were the only things that brought relief from the noise intolerance. Within hours, she'd encounter exactly what she needed, not vaguely, precisely. One morning, she sat in meditation wrestling with whether to quit her job at a prestigious firm where she felt creatively stifled. She'd been avoiding this decision for months, paralyzed by fear of financial insecurity. During meditation, no answer came, just the usual mental noise, eventually settling into stillness. She went for a walk afterward, mind quiet, and as she walked past a bookstore, a book literally fell off an outdoor display shelf as she passed. She picked it up. The Courage to be Disliked. She bought it, read it that evening, and by the end had clarity she'd been unable to reach through months of analytical thinking. Okay, she thought. Coincidence. But then it kept happening. She'd be wrestling with a question about a client project, would spend time in silent contemplation, and would overhear a conversation in a coffee shop that contained exactly the solution she needed. She'd be struggling with a relationship issue, would journal about it in solitude, and would open her social media to find a post from someone she hadn't talked to in years that directly addressed what she was processing. The rational part of Elena's mind said, confirmation bias, pattern recognition gone haywire, selective attention. But another part, a part that was growing stronger through her silent awakening, knew something else was happening. The timing was too precise, the relevance too specific, the pattern too consistent. Silence preceded synchronicity every single time. What Elena was experiencing is what Jung called synchronicity, a principle he spent the last decades of his life developing and defending against a scientific establishment that found it absurd. Synchronicity is meaningful coincidence, the simultaneous occurrence of events that are connected by meaning rather than causality. And Jung discovered that synchronicity multiplies dramatically during periods of individuation, particularly during the silent interior phases of awakening. To understand this, we need to grasp something radical about Jung's worldview. He didn't believe that psyche and matter were separate substances that occasionally interact. He believed they were two aspects of a unified reality, what he called the psychoid level, where psyche and matter are undifferentiated. At this level, inner states and outer events are connected not causally but meaningfully, participating in the same archetypal pattern. In practical terms, when you're activated at the archetypal level of psyche, when deep transformation is occurring, when the self is emerging, when you're in the midst of individuation, that activation doesn't just affect your inner world. It creates conditions in the external world that mirror and support the internal process, not because your thoughts are magically creating reality, but because at the deepest level, inner and outer participate in the same meaningful whole. This sounds mystical, but Jung insisted it was empirical observation. He documented thousands of cases of meaningful coincidence clustering around periods of psychological transformation. He worked with quantum physicists like Wolfgang Pauli to explore how consciousness and matter might be interconnected at fundamental levels. He wasn't trying to prove anything supernatural. He was trying to expand science's understanding of reality to include what he was consistently observing in clinical practice. And here's what's crucial. Synchronicity has a specific relationship to silence. When consciousness is noisy, full of plans, analysis, worry, constant mental chatter, you're locked in causal, linear thinking. You're seeing reality through the ego's framework. Causes produce effects. Events are random or causally connected. Meaning is something you assign to events rather than something inherent in them. This mode of consciousness is blind to synchronicity, but when consciousness becomes quiet, in meditation, in solitude, in silence, awareness shifts. You become permeable. You start perceiving patterns that linear thinking misses. You notice meaningful connections between inner states and outer events. And most mysteriously, you seem to become an attractor for what Jung called meaningful coincidence. The right book appears, the right person calls, the right information surfaces, not always, not mechanically, but with a frequency that transcends statistical probability. Let me break down the progression of synchronicity awareness that typically develops during silent awakening. Stage 1. Causal awareness only. This is how most people operate most of the time. Events are either causally connected or random. Coincidences are dismissed as just that, meaningless statistical flukes. This is ego consciousness operating in its default mode. Stage 2. Pattern noticing. You start seeing repeated symbols or numbers. Maybe you keep seeing 1111 on clocks. Maybe a specific animal keeps appearing when you're thinking about a particular issue. Maybe you keep hearing the same phrase from different sources. You're not sure what it means, but you're noticing patterns. Stage 3. Meaning recognition. Now you're understanding the personal significance of the patterns. When you see a hawk, you recognize it's connected to a question you've been sitting with. When a specific song plays, you understand it's reflecting something you need to hear. The coincidences have become communications. Stage 4. Synchronistic living. You're actively working with synchronicity as guidance. You pay attention to what appears in your life after periods of silence. You follow synchronistic leads. You trust the meaningful patterns you're perceiving. You're living in dialogue with a reality that seems to respond. Stage 5. Co-creative consciousness. This is the most advanced stage. You're not just noticing synchronicity, you're participating with it. You're aware that your interior states influence what manifests externally. You're consciously working at the level where psyche and matter interpenetrate. You've become a conscious participant in a meaningful universe. Elena moved through these stages over about 2 years, and each stage brought its own challenges, particularly because her rational mind kept fighting the experience. She'd have a profound synchronicity, recognize its meaning, follow its guidance, and then her inner skeptic would say, "You're making this up. You're seeing patterns that aren't there. You're becoming one of those people." But the synchronicities kept coming, and they were too specific, too timely, too consistently helpful to dismiss. So Elena began keeping what she called a synchronicity journal, documenting the pattern, time spent in silence, question or issue she was processing, synchronistic event that followed, outcome of following that guidance. Over time, the pattern became undeniable. Silent contemplation created openings for meaningful coincidence. It was as if silence made her transparent to a level of reality that constant mental noise had been blocking, or as if the silence allowed her to perceive connections that had always been present but were invisible to the chattering mind. Jung identified specific types of synchronicity that commonly occur during individuation. Recurring numbers. You keep seeing specific numbers, 1111, 333, sequences that catch your attention. Jung saw numbers as archetypal symbols carrying specific meanings. Your unconscious highlights these numbers when they're relevant to your process. Animal encounters, specific animals appearing repeatedly or at meaningful moments. Different traditions assign different meanings to animals, but Jung emphasized the personal significance. What does this creature mean to you? Why is it appearing now? Perfect timing of resources. The exact book, person, opportunity, or information you need appears precisely when you need it, not before when you wouldn't have been ready, not after when it would be irrelevant, exactly when needed. Thought-event correspondence. You think of someone and they immediately contact you. You wonder about something and turn on the radio to hear it discussed. Your internal state is instantly mirrored by external event. Meaningful conversations overheard. You're wrestling with a question and you overhear a stranger's conversation that directly addresses it. The probability of this is statistically insignificant, yet it happens repeatedly during awakening. Books and written material. Books falling off shelves, opening to relevant pages, articles appearing in your feed that address exactly what you're processing. Written material manifesting synchronistically to guide the process. The key feature of genuine synchronicity is that it's a causal. There's no cause and effect mechanism you can identify that explains why your internal state and the external event occurred together. Yet the meaning connection is undeniable. And during silent awakening, these meaningful coincidences cluster with a frequency that can't be explained by chance. Let me share something deeply personal about synchronicity in my own journey. During the darkest period of my awakening, when I had withdrawn from almost everything, when I was sitting for hours in silence daily, when I was seriously questioning whether I was having a spiritual emergence or a mental breakdown, I had a question I couldn't resolve. Am I moving toward healing or toward dissolution? I sat with this question for weeks, meditated on it, journaled about it, couldn't find an answer. One morning, after particularly deep meditation, I went for a walk. I was in a completely receptive state, quiet mind, open awareness, no agenda. And as I walked, I passed a sidewalk where children had been writing with chalk. Most of it was typical child drawings, flowers, stick figures, simple words. But one phrase, in what was clearly an adult's handwriting, stopped me cold. The only way out is through. I stood there reading it over and over because that was my answer, not the answer my ego wanted. My ego wanted reassurance that I could go back to how things were, but it was the truth. I wasn't dissolving. I was moving through dissolution towards something else, and the only way to reach that something else was to keep going through the process, not around it. Now, a skeptic would say, there are millions of phrases written on millions of sidewalks. Statistically, eventually you'll encounter one that seems relevant. And okay, maybe. But here's what that explanation misses: the subjective experience, the quality of recognition, the sense of being directly addressed by reality itself, the precision of timing, exactly when I needed that message, in a state of consciousness able to receive it. Jung didn't claim synchronicity proves anything metaphysical. He just said, this is what we observe. When people are in deep psychological transformation, meaningful coincidences multiply, and the people experiencing them know, subjectively, undeniably, that they're being guided by something. Elena eventually stopped fighting the experience and started working with it. She developed what she called synchronicity practice. After spending time in silence, particularly after meditation, she would pay extraordinary attention to the next few hours. What appeared? Who contacted her? What information came through? She'd follow synchronistic leads, even when they didn't make rational sense, just to see where they went. This practice led her to quit that prestigious firm, a decision synchronicity kept pointing toward through multiple convergent signs. It led her to a collaborative project with a designer she met through the most improbable chain of synchronistic events. It led her to a completely different way of working, where creativity and meaning mattered more than prestige and money. She described the shift like this: I used to think I had to figure everything out, plan everything, control outcomes. But working with synchronicity showed me there's an intelligence operating that's far more sophisticated than my ego's planning. Now I use silence to listen, and I use synchronicity to navigate. I still think, still plan, still work hard. But there's this other layer now, a sense of being guided, of participating in something that's guiding me. It makes life feel less like a struggle and more like a dance. But let's talk about the shadow side of synchronicity awareness, because it exists and it's important: ego hijacking. Once you discover synchronicity, ego can turn it into a spiritual performance. Look how synchronistic my life is. The universe is always sending me signs. This turns synchronicity into proof of specialness rather than recognition of a principle that operates for everyone, meaning inflation. Not everything is synchronicity. Sometimes coincidence is just coincidence. If you treat every trivial overlap of events as cosmically significant, you dilute the concept and risk losing discernment. Bypassing action. I'm waiting for a sign can become avoidance of decision-making. Synchronicity guides, but it doesn't eliminate the need for conscious choice and action. You still have to live your life, make decisions, take responsibility. Confirmation bias. If you're looking for synchronicity everywhere, you'll find it everywhere, even where it's not. This is why silence is crucial. It creates the conditions for genuine synchronicity rather than ego-manufactured patterns. Jung was clear about this. Synchronicity isn't constant, isn't mechanical, isn't proof of anything, and isn't a replacement for conscious effort. It's a principle that operates at specific moments, particularly during deep transformation, revealing something about the relationship between psyche and reality that materialist consciousness misses. The mirror effect with synchronicity is fascinating. People who aggressively dismiss all synchronicity as delusion or wishful thinking, what are they protecting against? They're protecting against living in an animated, responsive universe, against the possibility that reality is more mysterious than their worldview allows, against having to acknowledge that consciousness and matter might be interconnected in ways that threaten scientific materialism. This doesn't mean everyone who's skeptical about synchronicity is wrong. Healthy skepticism is valuable, but there's a difference between healthy skepticism and defensive dismissal. The person who says, I don't personally experience that, but I'm interested in your experience, is different from the person who says, "That's impossible, you're deluded, you're seeing patterns that aren't there." The defensive dismisser is revealing their own fear, fear of mystery, fear of losing the illusion of control, fear of a universe that might be meaningful rather than mechanical. Elena noticed this in her conversations. When she'd share synchronistic experiences with certain people, they'd immediately attack her rationality. "You're falling for magical thinking. You're becoming one of those New Age types. You need to get grounded in reality." These weren't concerned friends offering loving skepticism. These were people threatened by what her experience implied about reality, so she stopped sharing, not because she doubted her experience, but because some people aren't ready for a more mysterious universe. They need reality to be explicable, controllable, mechanical. And that's okay. That's where they are in their journey. But for you, if you're experiencing synchronicity, multiplying in the quiet spaces, if the right resources keep appearing, if you keep overhearing exactly what you need to hear, if the timing of events seems impossibly perfect, if you feel like you're in dialogue with reality itself, trust it. Work with it. Let it guide you. This isn't delusion. This is what happens when consciousness becomes still enough to perceive the meaningful patterns that noise and analysis obscure. This is what happens when the ego relaxes its grip and something deeper can communicate. This is what happens when you're awakening in silence. The silence makes you permeable to a level of reality that speaks in symbols, synchronicity, and meaningful coincidence. Jung wrote late in his life, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see." The key phrase, eyes to see. Those eyes don't develop in noise, analysis, or constant mental activity. They develop in silence, in stillness, in the receptive awareness that emerges when you stop trying to control and start paying attention. Your silence is opening those eyes. And what they're revealing is that you live in a far more mysterious, meaningful, responsive universe than you were taught. That's not evidence that you're losing your mind. It's evidence that you're finding yourself. The synchronicities aren't coincidence. They're communication. And the fact that they multiply in silence tells you something crucial. The silence isn't empty. It's the condition for perceiving what's always been present, a meaningful cosmos that speaks to those willing to listen. The fifth sign moves us into territory that Western culture systematically dismisses: somatic knowing. Your body becoming an exquisitely sensitive instrument that communicates truth, bypassing mental knowing with direct, undeniable physical signals that your mind cannot rationalize away. I want you to meet David. David is 43, a lawyer, someone who has built his entire career and identity on rational thinking, logical argument, mental prowess. His body was just the thing that carried his brain around. He ate when he remembered, slept when he had time, exercised, occasionally out of obligation rather than joy. He lived almost entirely in his head. Then, during his silent awakening, after months of noise intolerance, craving solitude, vivid dreams, and mounting synchronicities, David started noticing something strange. His body was giving him information his mind couldn't access, and it was more reliable than his thoughts. It started small. He'd be in a meeting. Someone would make a proposal that sounded perfectly reasonable, and David's chest would tighten. Not anxiety, exactly, something else. A clear signal of no that had nothing to do with logic. Or he'd be considering accepting a new case, running through all the rational reasons it made sense, and his gut would clench in unmistakable refusal. At first, David did what his legal training had taught him. He ignored these signals. Bodies give false alarms. Feelings aren't facts. Trust analysis, not sensation. But the signals got stronger, and eventually, out of curiosity more than conviction, David started conducting an experiment. He'd pay attention to what his body was telling him. even when it contradicted his mental reasoning, and see what happened. The results were undeniable. Every time his chest contracted around something, that thing turned out poorly, either for him directly or in ways he discovered later. Every time his body expanded with a sense of rightness, even when the logical argument wasn't clear. Following that expansion led to unexpectedly positive outcomes. His body, it turned out, knew things his brilliant legal mind could not figure out. From a Jungian perspective, what David was discovering is that the psyche isn't contained in the brain. It expresses through the entire organism. Jung wrote extensively about psychosomatic phenomena, not in the dismissive sense of "it's all in your head," but in the profound sense that psyche and soma, body, are two aspects of the same unified reality. What affects the psyche affects the body. What the body knows, the psyche can access. And during silent awakening, somatic intelligence moves from background noise to primary guidance. Here's why. Mental knowing operates through language, concepts, logical analysis, all functions of ego consciousness. But body knowing operates through sensation, through what Jung called the feeling function, through direct, immediate apprehension that doesn't require thought. And during individuation, as ego consciousness relaxes its dominance, somatic wisdom emerges. The progression typically looks like this. Stage 1. Body as object. You experience your body as separate from you, a thing you inhabit, that you manage and control. You ignore its signals unless they reach crisis level, injury, illness. This is where most Western adults exist most of the time. Stage 2. Symptom awareness. You start noticing patterns. Certain situations create tension in your shoulders. Specific people make your stomach tight. You're aware of these responses, but don't yet trust them as information. You might still dismiss them as stress, poor posture, needing more exercise. Stage 3. Pattern recognition. Now you're connecting body responses to external situations and internal states. You recognize that your jaw clenches around inauthenticity, your chest opens around alignment, your gut contracts around danger. The body is revealing itself as an instrument that reads reality. Stage 4. Trust development. This is a critical transition. You start believing your body's wisdom over your mind's rationalizations. When your gut says no, even though something looks good on paper, you trust the gut. This is terrifying for people who've built their lives on rational thinking. Stage 5. Somatic guidance. Your body becomes a primary decision-making instrument. You check with your body before committing to things. You use somatic response as a compass for navigating choices. You've learned your body speaks truth your mind cannot access. Stage 6. Psyche-soma unity. This is the most integrated state. You're no longer experiencing yourself as a mind that has a body. You're experiencing yourself as unified psyche-soma, thinking with your body, feeling with your mind, existing as an integrated whole where these distinctions dissolve. David moved through these stages over about 18 months, and the transformation was profound, not just in how he made decisions, but in how he experienced himself. He described it like this: I used to think I was my thoughts. My body was just there. But as I learned to listen to it, I realized my body was holding wisdom I'd been ignoring my entire life. It knew which people were safe before my mind assessed them. It knew which opportunities were aligned before I analyzed the pros and cons. It was like I'd been carrying this sophisticated guidance system around and never learned to read its signals. Jung understood that the body speaks the language of the unconscious. When unconscious content, shadow material, repressed emotions, unprocessed trauma cannot reach consciousness verbally, it expresses somatically. Tension, pain, constriction, illness, these aren't just physical problems. They're communications from the depths of the psyche, trying to make themselves known, through the only language that can break through mental defenses: sensation. During silent awakening, several specific somatic patterns commonly emerge. Gut feelings become undeniable. That visceral sense of knowing in your belly, not thought, not emotion, just immediate knowing, becomes impossible to ignore. You learn to distinguish true gut knowing from anxiety or fear. True gut knowing is quiet, certain, without story attached. Anxiety is loud, uncertain, full of catastrophic narrative. Energy levels indicate alignment. You notice that being around certain people or in certain situations drains you physically, while others energize you. This isn't about introversion or extroversion. It's about alignment. Your body physically responds to whether something is right for you or not. Physical symptoms reveal psychological truth. That chronic tension in your shoulders might be held responsibility that isn't yours. That tightness in your throat might be unspoken truth. That pain in your lower back might be lack of support, literally and metaphorically. The body is endlessly literal in how it expresses psychic states. Sexual energy shifts indicate transformation. Jung wrote extensively about libido, not just sexual desire, but psychic energy generally. During individuation, libido transforms. You might experience increased sexual energy as creative life force, or decreased sexual interest as energy redirects inward. These aren't problems, they're indicators of psychic transformation. Chronic issues may lift with integration. This is remarkable and often unexpected. When deep psychological material integrates, chronic physical symptoms sometimes resolve. Not always, not mechanically, but frequently enough that Jung considered it evidence of psyche-soma unity. The body was holding what the psyche couldn't consciously process. Once processed, the body can release it. Let me share something deeply personal. For years, from my early 20s through mid-30s, I had chronic upper back pain, constant, unrelenting, sometimes debilitating. I tried everything physical: chiropractic, massage, physical therapy, yoga, exercises, ergonomic adjustments. Nothing provided lasting relief. The pain became part of my identity, just something I lived with. Then, during my silent awakening, during a particularly deep period of solitude and inner work, I started exploring a question in therapy. What am I carrying that isn't mine? And as I explored this, discovering how much responsibility I'd taken on for others, how much I'd been holding that wasn't my burden, something astonishing happened. My back released, not gradually, suddenly. Weeks of severe pain just disappeared. I didn't believe it at first. I kept waiting for it to return, but it didn't. The pain had been my body's way of communicating what my mind couldn't acknowledge. I was carrying too much that wasn't mine to carry. Once I consciously recognized this, once I began the work of setting that burden down, my body didn't need to communicate it anymore. This doesn't mean all physical pain is psychological. Bodies have actual physical problems that need actual physical treatment. But Jung discovered, and I've experienced, that psyche and soma are so intimately connected that what cannot be processed psychologically often expresses somatically. And when the psychological processing finally happens, the somatic expression can resolve. David had his own version of this. For years he'd had digestive issues. Nothing medical tests could explain, just chronic discomfort, bloating, sensitivity. During his awakening, as he began trusting his gut intuition more, as he began honoring what his gut was telling him, rather than overriding it with mental reasoning, his digestive symptoms significantly improved. He told me, "It's like my gut was literally trying to tell me things, and when I wouldn't listen on an intuitive level, it started communicating on a physical level." Once I started trusting the intuitive messages, once I stopped swallowing what didn't feel right, my physical gut calmed down. Again, this doesn't mean all digestive issues are psychological, but it points to a profound connection between trusting somatic wisdom and somatic well-being. The mirror effect with somatic knowing is revealing. People who judge others for being too in their bodies or not rational enough, who dismiss somatic wisdom as woo-woo or unreliable, they're revealing their own dissociation, their own split between mind and body, their own fear of what their bodies might be trying to tell them. Because here's the thing, if you've been ignoring your body for decades, if you've been overriding its signals with mental reasoning, if you've been living entirely in your head, your body has a lot of stored communication. And if you started listening, you'd have to acknowledge all the ways you've been betraying yourself. All the times you said yes when your gut said no. All the times you stayed when your body wanted to leave. All the times you forced yourself into situations your body was clearly rejecting. That reckoning is uncomfortable, so it's easier to dismiss people who live somatically as unsophisticated, as not using their minds properly, as too focused on feeling instead of thinking. This is defense, pure and simple. Defense against having to acknowledge that the body might be wiser than the mind they've spent their lives developing. David noticed this in his legal colleagues. When he'd mentioned following his gut on a case decision, they'd dismiss it. That's not how law works. You need evidence, precedent, logical argument. And David would think, yes, and there's another level of knowing that operates beneath all that. A knowing that reads the situation holistically, that picks up on subtle cues logical analysis misses, that integrates more data points than conscious thought can hold. But he stopped trying to convince them, because people discover somatic wisdom when they're ready, not when you argue them into it. Let me give you practical guidance for developing somatic awareness if you're in this phase of awakening. Body scan practice. Several times daily, pause and scan your body from head to toe. Where is there tension? Where is there ease? Where is there sensation? You're not trying to change anything, just developing awareness of what's present. Check before committing. Before saying yes to anything significant, pause and check your body. Does your chest expand or contract? Does your gut open or tighten? Does your whole system relax or tense? Let that be data in your decision-making. Track pattern over time. Journal somatic responses and outcomes. When your body said no and you overrode it, what happened? When you trusted a body yes, where did it lead? Over time, you'll see your body's reliability. Distinguish sensation from story. True somatic knowing is pure sensation without narrative. Fear and anxiety come with stories. This will go wrong because gut knowing is just knowing, without explanation. Learn to distinguish these. Move and express. Somatic wisdom often emerges through movement. Dance, shake, stretch, walk, not as exercise but as expression. Let your body move how it wants to move and see what releases or surfaces. Somatic therapy. Consider working with practitioners trained in somatic approaches, somatic experiencing, body-centered psychotherapy, Hakomi, etc. These modalities specifically work with body wisdom. There's a reason you've been avoiding silence, and it's not what you think. You tell yourself you're too busy, that you need the stimulation to function, that silence feels boring or unproductive. But underneath all those rational explanations is something much more primal. You know, on some level, that if you get quiet enough, something you've been running from is going to catch up with you. And you're right. The sixth sign of silent awakening is the most confronting, the most difficult, and paradoxically, the most healing. Past wounds surface for integration, not to torment you, not to prove that you're broken or that your healing journey has failed, but because your psyche has finally judged you strong enough to hold what you couldn't hold before. Silence doesn't create these wounds. Silence reveals them. and revelation is the first step toward integration. Let me tell you about Rachel. Rachel was 42 years old and considered herself psychologically healthy. She'd done therapy in her 20s after a difficult breakup. She'd read the self-help books. She'd processed her childhood, or so she thought. She had a good relationship with her parents now. She rarely thought about her early years except in passing, the way anyone might remember their past without it carrying emotional charge. She started meditating as a stress management tool, 20 minutes each morning before work. Nothing intense, nothing spiritual, just basic mindfulness to manage her anxiety and improve focus. For the first few weeks, it worked exactly as advertised. She felt calmer, more centered, better able to handle the chaos of her job as a high school teacher. And then, in week 4, during a perfectly ordinary meditation session, a wave of sadness hit her so hard she couldn't breathe. Not sadness about anything current, nothing had happened, no trigger she could identify, just overwhelming, crushing sadness that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. She opened her eyes, shook it off, went about her day. But the next morning, it happened again, and the morning after that. Each time she sat in silence, the sadness would emerge, sometimes as a wave, sometimes as a steady ache, sometimes as full-body sobbing she couldn't control. She thought she was having a breakdown. She considered stopping the meditation, but something kept her going, some intuition that this wasn't pathology. This was process. After 2 weeks of this, a memory surfaced. Not a dramatic memory, not abuse or trauma in the conventional sense, just a scene. Herself at 7 years old, sitting at the kitchen table after school, trying to tell her mother about something that had happened. She couldn't remember what, and her mother, distracted and stressed, saying, "Not now, Rachel, Mommy's busy." Such a small moment, such an ordinary moment, the kind of thing that happens in every household, with every parent who's overwhelmed and every child who needs attention at an inconvenient time. But as Rachel sat with this memory, she felt the 7-year-old's pain as if it were happening now. The feeling of being invisible, the feeling of her inner world not mattering, the feeling of learning that her emotions were an inconvenience to the people who were supposed to care. She realized this moment wasn't the only one. This was the pattern. Her entire childhood was characterized by well-meaning but emotionally unavailable parents who couldn't hold space for her feelings. And so she'd learned not to have feelings. She'd learned to be self-sufficient. She'd learned that her emotional needs were too much, and so she'd made herself small enough not to need anything from anyone. She thought she'd dealt with this in therapy 20 years ago. She thought she'd forgiven her parents. She thought she'd moved on. But she'd intellectualized it. She'd understood it cognitively. She'd never actually felt it, integrated it, allowed it to move through her system completely. Her psyche had stored it, waiting for the day when consciousness was strong enough to hold it. And the silence had created that container. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The unconscious stores unprocessed material until consciousness is strong enough to integrate it." This isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature. It's the psyche's wisdom. If Rachel had felt the full impact of that childhood emotional abandonment when she was 7, it would have been overwhelming. She didn't have the ego strength, the psychological resources, or the support structure to hold it. So her psyche did what healthy psyches do. It encapsulated the material, stored it in the unconscious, and waited for her nervous system to develop, waited for her ego to strengthen, waited for her life circumstances to stabilize, waited for her to have the resources, internal and external, to finally process what happened. And when she began sitting in silence every morning, her psyche recognized, the container is ready, it's time. Jung wrote extensively about this phenomenon. He understood that the unconscious isn't a garbage dump where we throw material we don't want to deal with. It's a holding space, a preservation system. It keeps material viable until we can metabolize it. But here's the key. That material doesn't dissolve on its own. It doesn't heal just because time passes. Time doesn't heal wounds. Integration heals wounds. And integration requires conscious attention, emotional processing, and somatic release. Silence creates the conditions for integration. Distraction prevents it. We need to understand the mechanism here because otherwise, this process feels random and cruel. Why now? Why, when you're finally trying to do something healthy, trying to develop a meditation practice, trying to cultivate inner peace, does your psyche dump decades of unprocessed pain on you? Because constant distraction has been keeping the traumatic material submerged, not healed, not integrated, just submerged. Think about how you've lived your life up until this point. When difficult emotions arise, what do? You scroll, you watch something, you call someone, you have a drink, you go shopping, you work out, you clean the house, you plan something, you do anything except sit still and feel what's trying to emerge. This isn't weakness. This is normal human behavior in a culture that pathologizes difficult emotions and commercializes distraction. You've been taught that uncomfortable feelings are problems to be solved or symptoms to be medicated, not messages to be heard. But those emotions don't go away just because you've distracted yourself from them. They go underground. They get stored in your unconscious, in your body, in your dreams, in your behavioral patterns. They shape your life from beneath conscious awareness. And then you start sitting in silence. No phone, no TV, no music, no planning, no doing. Just sitting, just breathing, just being. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, there's space. Space for what's been trying to surface. Space for what's been waiting. Space for the material your psyche has been protecting until you were strong enough to face it. The silence doesn't create the wounds. The silence reveals them. And revelation is the first step toward healing. This process follows a predictable pattern. Understanding these stages helps you navigate them with less confusion and more trust in the process. Stage 1. Successful repression. This is where you've been living. The past seems resolved. You've dealt with your childhood, your trauma, your difficult experiences. You can talk about them without much emotional charge. You've forgiven the people involved. You've moved on with your life. From a conscious perspective, everything is handled. But from the unconscious perspective, the material has simply been stored effectively. You've contained it, but you haven't integrated it. There's a difference. Containment is necessary. You can't integrate material before you have the capacity to hold it. But containment isn't completion. It's just the first phase. Stage 2. Silence practice begins. You start sitting in silence. Meditation, contemplation, prayer, or just quiet mornings with no agenda. You're not doing this to excavate old wounds. You're doing it for stress reduction, clarity, spiritual development, whatever your conscious motivation is. But you're creating space, and space is exactly what the unconscious has been waiting for. At first, nothing seems to happen. You feel calmer, more centered. The practice seems to be working exactly as you hoped. Stage 3. Emotional flooding. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, you're hit with overwhelming emotions. Sadness, rage, fear, grief. Sometimes all of them at once, sometimes one at a time, sometimes in waves that feel like they'll never stop. This is the most disorienting stage because it doesn't feel like it's related to anything current. Nothing happened. No one hurt you recently. There's no logical reason for these feelings. This is when most people quit. They think the meditation is making them depressed. They think something is wrong with them. They think they're regressing instead of progressing. But what's actually happening is emergence. Material that's been stored is finally being allowed to surface, and it surfaces with the full emotional intensity it had when it was originally stored, even if that was decades ago. Rachel's sadness wasn't mild adult reflection on childhood disappointment. It was the full, overwhelming sadness of a 7-year-old who felt invisible and unimportant. That's what had been stored. That's what needed to be felt and released. Stage 4, memory emergence. As you stay with the emotions instead of running from them, memories begin to surface. Sometimes they're memories you'd forgotten completely. Sometimes they're memories you remembered factually but without emotional content. Sometimes they're not specific memories but general impressions, felt senses of how things were. This isn't false memory or imagination. This is the unconscious finally having permission to show you what it's been carrying. The emotions came first because the emotions were what got stored. The cognitive memory is just the context for understanding where the emotions came from. Not everyone gets clear memories. Some people just get the emotional content without narrative. That's fine. The memories aren't the point. The integration is the point. You don't need to reconstruct your entire past. You just need to feel what's been waiting to be felt. Stage 5, pattern recognition. This is where it gets profound. You begin to see how these unintegrated wounds have been running your life from beneath conscious awareness. Rachel realized that her entire adult relationship pattern was shaped by that childhood experience of emotional abandonment. She chose partners who were emotionally unavailable, not consciously, not deliberately, but she was recreating the familiar dynamic, trying to win the love and attention she didn't get as a child. She also realized why she'd become a teacher who was absolutely devoted to her students' emotional well-being. She was giving them what she hadn't received. This wasn't bad. It made her an exceptional teacher, but she hadn't understood the unconscious motivation. She saw how she'd learned to dismiss her own needs, to be low maintenance in relationships, to pride herself on not being needy or emotional. She'd turned her wound into an identity, and she'd been performing strength while carrying unintegrated pain. This recognition is crucial. You're not just processing old emotions for the sake of catharsis. You're understanding how the past has been shaping the present. You're seeing the invisible architecture of your personality, the defenses, the compensations, the adaptations you made to survive situations that aren't relevant anymore. Stage 6, integration work. Now comes the actual work of integration. This isn't just feeling the emotions and moving on. This is consciously working with the material through therapy, through journaling, through somatic practices, through creative expression, through whatever methods allow you to metabolize what's surfaced. Integration means several things. Feeling the emotions fully instead of just thinking about them. Understanding the cognitive content without getting lost in story. Releasing what's been stored in the body. Separating past from present. Recognizing that what was true then isn't necessarily true now. Grieving what was lost or never received. Reclaiming parts of yourself that were split off or suppressed. Developing compassion for yourself as you were then. This stage takes time. You can't rush integration. The material surfaces in layers, not all at once. You work with what emerges, and when that layer is integrated, the next one surfaces. Stage 7, resolution. Resolution doesn't mean the memories disappear or that you forget what happened. Resolution means you can carry the memory without it carrying an emotional charge that controls you. Rachel can now think about her childhood emotional neglect without collapsing into that 7-year-old's pain. She has compassion for her younger self. She has compassion for her parents, who were doing their best with their own unintegrated material. She understands how it shaped her, but it no longer unconsciously drives her. The wound has been transformed into wisdom. The pain has been metabolized into compassion. The unintegrated fragment has been brought into the wholeness of her psyche. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not becoming perfect but becoming whole, including the wounded parts, integrating what was split off, bringing the unconscious into consciousness. Jung understood something profound about psychological development. Transformation requires descending into wounds, not transcending them. This is completely contrary to popular spirituality, which often promotes the idea of rising above your pain, transcending your trauma, vibrating higher than your wounds. But Jung saw this as spiritual, bypassing, using spirituality to avoid the descent that genuine transformation requires. He wrote extensively about the wounded healer archetype, the understanding that the healer's power comes directly from their own woundedness, not from having transcended their wounds, but from having descended into them, integrated them, and emerged with the wisdom those wounds carry. This is why silence is so crucial to the awakening process. Silence is the descent. Silence is the willingness to go down into what you've been avoiding, to face what you've been running from, to feel what you've been numbing. The noise culture tells you to keep rising, keep achieving, keep optimizing, keep improving. Jung says, go down, go into the wound. That's where the transformation is. He wrote, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul. Read that again. People will do anything, literally anything, to avoid facing their own soul. They'll work themselves to exhaustion. They'll maintain toxic relationships. They'll stay in careers they hate. They'll numb themselves with substances, shopping, sex, food, entertainment. Anything except silence. Anything except descent. Anything except facing what's waiting in the depths. Because what's waiting isn't comfortable. What's waiting is every wound you've successfully kept submerged. Every abandonment, every betrayal, every moment of shame, every instance of feeling invisible, unworthy, too much, or not enough. Every traumatic experience your psyche protected you from feeling fully at the time. It's all there, waiting. And the only way out is through. Let me be specific about what wound surfacing looks like during silent awakening, because you need to recognize it when it happens. Sudden grief without present trigger. You're sitting in meditation and suddenly you're sobbing. Not gentle tears, full body sobbing, and there's no reason. Nothing happened. No one died. No tragedy occurred. Just overwhelming grief coming from somewhere deep and ancient. This is stored grief finally being released. Grief from losses you never properly mourned. Grief from a childhood that wasn't what you needed. Grief from the person you had to become to survive. Grief from all the moments you had to be strong when you needed to fall apart. Let it come. This is the psyche emptying its reservoir of accumulated sorrow. You're not creating the grief. You're releasing it. Anger toward people from the past. Suddenly you're furious at your father for criticism you haven't thought about in 20 years, or your mother for emotional unavailability you thought you'd forgiven, or a teacher who shamed you, or a friend who betrayed you, or a partner who hurt you. The anger feels disproportionate. That was so long ago. They were doing their best. They didn't know better. You're over it, except you're not. Your conscious mind was over it. Your unconscious was still carrying the unprocessed anger. And now it's surfacing. This doesn't mean you need to confront these people. It doesn't mean they were monsters or that you're a victim. It means you need to feel the anger you weren't allowed to feel at the time, to give it space, to let it move through your system. Anger isn't dangerous. Repressed anger is dangerous. Expressed, felt, integrated anger is cleansing. Body memories of trauma. This is the most intense manifestation, and it requires careful navigation. your body begins to re-experience traumatic events somatically, not just remembering them cognitively, but feeling them physically. Your chest tightens in the same way it did during a childhood panic attack. Your throat constricts the way it did when you were told your voice didn't matter. Your body freezes the way it did during a traumatic experience. This is stored trauma releasing from your tissues. Trauma doesn't just get stored in memory, it gets stored in the body. And when the nervous system finally feels safe enough, it begins to release what it's been holding. If this happens, proceed carefully. This is where professional support becomes crucial. Trauma release needs to happen slowly, in a titrated way, with proper containment. You can't just force this material through. You need support, safety, and the right therapeutic tools. Shame spirals about old events. Suddenly you're consumed with shame about something that happened years ago. Something you did wrong, something you're not proud of, some version of yourself that embarrasses you now. The shame feels overwhelming and irrational. Why are you thinking about this now? It's ancient history. It doesn't matter anymore. But to your psyche, it does matter, because you never processed the shame at the time. You just stored it, buried it, moved on. And now it's surfacing so you can finally feel it, understand it, have compassion for yourself as you were then, and release it. Shame thrives in darkness. When it surfaces into the light of conscious awareness, it can finally be metabolized. Recurring thoughts of past relationships. An ex-partner you haven't thought about in years suddenly occupies your thoughts constantly, not because you want them back, but because that relationship carried material you never integrated. Maybe they mirrored a parent's pattern. Maybe the ending carried grief you never felt. Maybe you betrayed yourself in that relationship in ways you've never acknowledged. Maybe you lost parts of yourself you need to reclaim. The relationship is over, but the psychological material it activated isn't integrated yet. Your psyche is bringing it back up so you can finally work with it. Dreams, processing old material. Your dreams become flooded with people, places, and situations from your past. Childhood homes, old friends, past versions of yourself, symbolic representations of wounds. Jung understood dreams as the unconscious's primary communication channel. During silent awakening, when you're finally paying attention, the unconscious uses dreams to show you what needs integration. Don't dismiss these dreams as meaningless recycling of old memories. They're purposeful. They're showing you the material that's ready to be worked with. Jung said something that everyone quotes, but few people actually heed. That which we need the most will be found where we least want to look. This is the essence of shadow work. This is the heart of individuation. This is why wound surfacing during silent awakening is both terrifying and absolutely necessary. What you've been avoiding, that's exactly what you need to face. What you've been running from, that's exactly where the medicine is. What you've kept in the dark, that's exactly what needs to come into the light. Silence forces you to look where you've been avoiding. There's nowhere left to run, no distraction left to hide behind, just you and the material that's been waiting. This is why people resist silence with such intensity. Not because silence is boring, not because they're too busy, but because they know on some unconscious level that silence will require them to face what they've been successfully avoiding their entire lives. Why this surfacing happens now, the psyche's timing. We need to address this directly because people often feel betrayed by the process. I was doing fine. I had my life together. I started meditating and now I'm falling apart. This was supposed to help, not make things worse. But nothing is falling apart. Things are falling into place. Your psyche's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't feel that way. Here's what's actually happening. Your psyche judges you strong enough. The unconscious has been monitoring your capacity this entire time. It knows when you're strong enough to handle integration. It knows when your ego structure is solid enough to hold difficult material without collapsing. The fact that this material is surfacing now means your psyche has determined you can handle this. You finally have the resources, internal and external, to work with what you couldn't work with before. This is a compliment, not a punishment. Your psyche trusts you now in a way it didn't before. The self is clearing obstacles to wholeness. From Jung's perspective, the self, the organizing center of the psyche, is driving the individuation process, and the self doesn't want you to be comfortable. It wants you to be whole. Comfort requires maintaining the status quo. Wholeness requires integrating everything you've split off, repressed, and disowned. The self is clearing the obstacles to your wholeness, and those obstacles are your unintegrated wounds. This isn't cruelty. This is the self's wisdom. You can't become whole while carrying fragmented, unprocessed material in your unconscious. It has to surface, it has to be felt, it has to be integrated. Individuation requires transforming wounds into wisdom. Jung's entire model of psychological development is built on this principle. Your wounds don't need to be eliminated. They need to be transformed. The wounded parts of you carry wisdom that the unwounded parts don't have. Your trauma gave you sensitivity, compassion, depth, understanding that you wouldn't have otherwise. Not because trauma is good, it's not, but because your response to trauma developed capacities in you, but you can't access that wisdom while the wounds are still unconscious and unintegrated. They have to surface. They have to be worked with. They have to be brought into consciousness. Then, only then, do they transform from unconscious drivers of your behavior into conscious sources of wisdom and power. I need to share something personal here because this isn't theoretical for me. This was my lived experience, and it nearly destroyed me before I understood what was happening. I was 6 months into daily meditation practice when a memory surfaced that I had completely repressed for 23 years. I won't share the details. They're not necessary, and they're not the point. What matters is that this memory was traumatic in a way that my 10-year-old self couldn't process. So my psyche did the intelligent thing. It encapsulated it, stored it, and waited. 23 years. The entire time, this material was shaping my life, my relationships, my career choices, my sexual patterns, my self-worth, everything. I was being driven by unconscious material I didn't know existed, and then during meditation, it surfaced, not gently, not gradually, all at once, with full sensory detail and complete emotional intensity. I thought I was losing my mind. I thought the meditation had broken something in me. I stopped meditating immediately. I tried to go back to my normal life. But you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Once material surfaces, it won't go back down. It demands attention. It demands integration. I spent 6 months in intensive therapy, working with this material. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. There were days I didn't think I would survive it. Not metaphorically, I mean I genuinely didn't know if I could metabolize that much pain without breaking, but I had the support I needed. I had a therapist who understood trauma integration. I had friends who held space for me. I had enough ego strength to contain the process without collapsing. And on the other side of that integration, my entire life changed. Patterns that had controlled me for decades released. Relationships that had been painful became possible. Creative work that had been blocked flowed freely. Self-worth that had been conditional became solid. The wound transformed into wisdom. The trauma that had been unconsciously driving me became consciously available as a source of depth, compassion, and understanding. I'm not grateful that the trauma happened. I'm grateful that I finally integrated it. There's a difference, and none of that integration would have been possible without the silence that created the space for it to surface. The mirror effect. judging others for not getting over their past. Now, we need to look at something uncomfortable again, because your shadow is showing itself in your judgments. Who do you judge for being stuck in their past? Who irritates you because they keep talking about their childhood trauma, their old relationships, their wounds that you think they should be over by now? Why can't they just move on? Why do they keep bringing up stuff from years ago? Why can't they let go and focus on the present? Your judgment is revealing material you've repressed rather than integrated. If you judge people for being stuck in their past, it's often because you've forced yourself to move on from your own past without actually processing it. You've repressed your own wounds and convinced yourself that's strength. And when you see people who are actually doing the work of integration, feeling their old pain, working with their material, it threatens your defense mechanism. The mirror effect works both ways. Maybe you judge people for being too focused on healing because you've avoided your own healing. Or maybe you judge people for being in denial about their trauma because you're hyper-focused on yours in a way that's become an identity rather than a process. Either way, your judgment shows you what you need to integrate. The person who successfully integrated their wounds can witness others' healing processes without judgment. They know how hard it is. They know it doesn't follow a timeline. They know everyone's process is different. If you're judging, you're not integrated yet. Your judgment is showing you where you're still carrying unmetabolized material. So how do you work with this material when it surfaces? How do you navigate wound integration without re-traumatizing yourself or getting lost in the pain? First, understand. This requires support. If significant trauma is surfacing, you need professional help. This isn't weakness. This isn't failure. This is wisdom. Trauma integration isn't a DIY project. You need a skilled therapist who understands trauma, who can help you titrate the process, releasing the material slowly enough that your nervous system can handle it. But there are practices you can do alongside professional support. Pendulation. This is a somatic practice where you move your attention back and forth between the traumatic activation and a sense of safety or resource. You don't stay immersed in the trauma. You touch it, then return to safety. Touch it again, return to safety. This teaches your nervous system that you can engage the material without being overwhelmed by it. Somatic resourcing. Before working with trauma, you establish resources in your body, places, memories, or sensations that feel safe and grounding. When you're activated by traumatic material, you return to these resources to regulate your nervous system. Compassionate witness. You develop the capacity to witness your own pain with compassion rather than judgment. You speak to yourself the way you'd speak to a hurt child, gently, kindly, with infinite patience. Timeline work. You consciously remind yourself that what you're feeling happened in the past and is not happening now. This sounds simple, but when trauma is activated, your nervous system genuinely can't tell the difference between past and present. You have to actively help it distinguish. Creative expression. Sometimes trauma can't be processed verbally. It needs to be expressed through art, movement, music, writing. Jung understood this. Active imagination as a way to work with unconscious material. Community. You need people who can hold space for your process without trying to fix you or rushing you through it. Healing happens in connection, not isolation. Critical warnings about the non-linear nature. But I need to give you realistic expectations. This process is not linear. It doesn't follow a clean progression from pain to healing. It's messy. It's cyclical. It's frustrating. You'll think you've integrated a wound, and then a year later, it surfaces again at a deeper layer. You'll feel like you're regressing when you're actually spiraling upward, covering the same material but at a different level of integration. Jung called this circumambulation, walking around the center again and again, each time getting closer to the core. This is how psychic integration works. You don't heal a wound once and move on. You integrate it in layers over time as your capacity to hold it increases. Some wounds take months to integrate, some take years, some take a lifetime. This isn't failure. This is the reality of deep psychological work. And here's what no one tells you. Integrated wounds can still hurt. Integration doesn't mean the pain disappears. It means you can hold the pain consciously without it controlling you unconsciously. Rachel's childhood emotional abandonment still hurts when she thinks about it. But now she holds it with compassion for herself as she was then and understanding for her parents as they were then. The hurt doesn't drive her behavior anymore. It's transformed from an unconscious wound into conscious wisdom. And this is the promise that makes the difficulty worthwhile. Every integrated wound becomes wisdom and power rather than an unconscious driver. Your wounds stop controlling you from the shadows and start informing you from consciousness. The trauma that made you fragile becomes the source of your resilience. The pain that isolated you becomes the basis of your compassion. The experiences that broke you become the foundation of your strength. Jung said, "The wounded physician heals himself by healing others." But first, you have to acknowledge you're wounded. You have to descend into the wounds. You have to feel what you've been avoiding. You have to integrate what you've repressed. There's no shortcut. There's no bypassing. There's no transcending without first descending. The silence creates the container for this descent. The wound surfacing isn't a problem with your practice. It's proof that your practice is working. Your psyche is finally strong enough to hold what it couldn't hold before. This is the sixth sign of silent awakening. Past wounds surface for integration, not to prove you're broken, but to make you whole. Not to torment you, but to free you. Not to keep you stuck in the past, but to finally release you into the present. Because you can't be fully present while carrying unintegrated past. The wounds you haven't processed are running your life from beneath conscious awareness. They're shaping your choices, your relationships, your sense of self, and you don't even know it. Silence makes them visible, and visibility is the first step toward integration. Jung's entire life work was built on this understanding. The path to wholeness runs through the wound. You don't become individuated by transcending your pain. You become individuated by descending into it, feeling it fully, understanding it deeply, and integrating it completely. This is difficult. This is painful. This is confronting. And this is absolutely necessary. But wound surfacing isn't the only way. The silence strips away what's been comfortable and familiar. There's another dissolution happening, one that might surprise you even more. All those spiritual practices you've been devoted to, the rituals, the communities, the teachers, the techniques that have been your path for years, they're about to lose their appeal, not because you've failed spiritually, but because you're finally ready for something more direct, something more authentic, something that doesn't require intermediaries between you and the divine. The external structures that carried you this far are about to fall away, and in their absence, you'll discover what was always underneath. Here's something no one in the spiritual community wants to admit. There comes a point in genuine awakening when all the practices, all the teachers, all the rituals that brought you to this moment become empty. Not wrong, not useless, not false, just empty. Like a shell that served its purpose but no longer contains what you need. And this emptiness feels like betrayal. It feels like spiritual failure. It feels like you're doing something wrong, falling backwards, losing your way. Because everything you've been taught about the spiritual path says, be devoted, be disciplined, be consistent, follow the practices, honor the teachers, stay with the tradition, but your entire being is saying, stop. The seventh sign of silent awakening is one of the most confusing and guilt-inducing conventional spiritual practice loses its appeal. Not gradually, not through conscious decision, but suddenly, completely, undeniably. You simply cannot bring yourself to do the things that used to feel essential to your spiritual life, and you have no idea what this means or where you're going. Let me tell you about Michael. Michael had been practicing yoga for 15 years, not casually, devotedly. He attended class 4 times a week without fail. He'd done teacher training. He'd been to India twice to study with his guru. His entire identity was wrapped up in being a yogi, the way he ate, the way he dressed, the community he belonged to, the values he lived by. Yoga wasn't just exercise for Michael. It was his spiritual path, his practice, his connection to something larger than himself. The mat was his sacred space. The studio was his temple. His teacher was his guide. And then, 9 months into his silent awakening, those early morning hours he'd started spending just sitting. No agenda, no technique, just present. Something shifted. He was getting ready for his Wednesday evening class, rolling up his mat, grabbing his water bottle, and he felt nothing. Not resistance exactly, not aversion, just complete absence of the pull that had drawn him to practice for 15 years. He went anyway. Surely this was just a temporary mood. Surely once he got on the mat, the familiar joy would return. But it didn't. He moved through the asanas mechanically. His teacher's guidance, the same guidance that used to feel profound, sounded hollow. The spiritual language that used to resonate felt performative. Even his breath work, which had always been his anchor, felt like he was going through motions rather than touching something real. He left class early, told himself he was tired. He'd come back next week, but next week felt the same. And the week after that. By month 3, he'd stopped going entirely. The guilt was crushing. He felt like he was abandoning his path, betraying his teacher, losing his spiritual center. His friends from the yoga community kept asking if he was okay, and he didn't know how to explain that he was fine. Better than fine, actually, but he just couldn't bring himself to practice anymore. What he wanted, what he craved, was to sit in silence. No technique, no tradition, no teacher telling him what to do or how to breathe or what to visualize. Just silence. Direct, unmediated, unstructured silence. He thought something was wrong with him. He thought he was regressing. He thought maybe he was depressed. But what was actually happening was far more profound. His psyche was withdrawing projection from external spiritual authorities and practices, redirecting that energy toward direct encounter with the self. He was ready for something he didn't have a name for yet. Jung made a crucial distinction that most spiritual seekers never understand: the difference between collective religious and spiritual forms versus individual relationship with the numinous. Collective forms, traditions, practices, rituals, communities, teachers, serve an essential purpose. They carry the projection of the divine when individual consciousness isn't yet strong enough for direct encounter. They're the containers, the vehicles, the intermediaries that make spiritual experience accessible. But they're intermediaries, and genuine awakening eventually requires the dissolution of intermediaries. Jung wrote, "The individual who wishes to have an answer to the problem of evil, as it is posed today, has need, first and foremost, of self-knowledge, that is, the utmost possible knowledge of his own wholeness. He must know relentlessly how much good he can do and what crimes he is capable of. Neither can be achieved without considerable self-examination. This self-knowledge, this direct encounter with your own psyche, cannot be mediated by external forms forever. At a certain point, the forms become obstacles rather than gateways. Not because they're wrong, but because you've outgrown them. This is what's happening during the 7th sign of silent awakening. Your psyche is ready for direct experience. and every external structure, no matter how beneficial it was, is now in the way. We need to understand what's actually occurring psychologically, because otherwise this feels like spiritual failure when it's actually spiritual maturation. When you first encounter spiritual practice, whether it's meditation, yoga, prayer, ritual, or any other form, you project onto it. You project your longing for connection, your need for meaning, your search for the divine, your desire for transformation. This projection is necessary. It's how the psyche works. We project outward what we cannot yet hold inward. The practice becomes the container for spiritual energy that your individual consciousness isn't yet developed enough to hold directly. Your teacher becomes the wise one you haven't yet recognized in yourself. The community becomes the belonging you haven't yet found within. The ritual becomes the sacred space you haven't yet accessed internally. The technique becomes the gateway to states you haven't yet stabilized as your ground. All of this is appropriate and necessary for spiritual development. You need the external structures until your internal capacity develops. But during silent awakening, something fundamental shifts. Your psyche begins to develop the capacity to hold directly what it previously needed to project onto external forms. And when that capacity develops, the projections automatically begin to withdraw. Not because you're deciding to withdraw them. This isn't a conscious choice. The psyche self-regulates. When external projection is no longer necessary, it naturally dissolves. This is what Michael was experiencing. His psyche was saying, you don't need the external practice anymore. You're ready for direct encounter. The intermediary has served its purpose. This process unfolds in predictable stages. Understanding them helps you navigate the dissolution without panic or guilt. Stage 1. External seeking. This is where everyone starts. You're looking outside yourself for spiritual truth, teachers who know more than you, practices that will transform you, communities that will support you, traditions that will guide you. This external seeking isn't wrong. It's developmentally appropriate. You're building the container that will eventually hold direct experience. You're learning the language. You're strengthening your spiritual capacity. Michael spent years here, immersing himself in yoga philosophy, learning from teachers, practicing techniques, building spiritual muscle. Stage 2. Dedicated practice. You've found your path. You commit to it fully. You follow the prescribed practices. You trust the tradition. You honor the teachers. You show up consistently. This is the disciplined phase. You're doing the work. You're seeing results, states of peace, moments of insight, physical health, emotional regulation. The practice is working. For Michael, this phase lasted over a decade. The yoga practice was genuinely transformative. He became healthier, more centered, more conscious. None of it was false. None of it was wasted. Stage 3. Growing emptiness. Then, subtly at first, the practices begin to feel hollow. The rituals that used to feel meaningful start to feel like performance. The community gatherings that used to nourish you start to feel draining. The teacher's words that used to land with impact start to feel repetitive. You can't quite name what's wrong. The practices haven't changed. The teacher hasn't changed. But something in you has changed, and suddenly everything feels empty. This is the beginning of projection withdrawal. The external forms are losing their charge because your psyche is preparing to hold the energy directly. Stage 4. Guilt and confusion. You think something's wrong with you. You think you're being lazy or undisciplined. You think you're losing your spiritual connection. You think you're betraying your path. The guilt can be intense, especially if you've been part of a spiritual community for years. They're still devoted. They're still showing up. What's wrong with you that you suddenly can't? This is the most confusing stage because you don't understand what's happening. From the outside, it looks like you're giving up. From the inside, it feels like you're being authentically guided, even though you can't explain where. Stage 5. Withdrawal. You stop attending classes, gatherings, or services. You stop doing the formal practices. You might keep your meditation cushion or your yoga mat, but you don't use them the way you used to. This isn't a conscious decision to abandon your path. It's an organic withdrawal. You simply cannot bring yourself to engage with the external forms anymore. Not from rebellion, not from doubt, from completion. The forms served their purpose. That phase is complete. Your psyche is moving you towards something else. Stage 6. Void period. This is the most difficult and most important stage. You have no structure, no prescribed path, no teacher telling you what to do, no community holding you accountable, no ritual providing form, just emptiness, just unknowing, just void. This feels like spiritual death because it is spiritual death, the death of the externally structured spiritual life, the death of following someone else's path, the death of relying on intermediaries between you and the divine. Most people panic here. They either force themselves back into the old structures or they jump to new ones, a different tradition, a different teacher, a different technique, anything to escape the void. But the void is exactly where you need to be. The void is the womb of direct experience. Nothing can be born there if you keep filling it with external forms. Stage 7. Direct encounter. If you can stay in the void without filling it, if you can tolerate the emptiness without rushing to replace what dissolved, something emerges that was always underneath. Not a new practice, not a new teacher, not a new tradition. Direct, unmediated encounter with the numinous, with the self, with what Jung called the God image within the psyche. This isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like what you thought awakening would look like. It's quiet, it's ordinary, it's so intimate and so undeniable that you can't talk about it without it sounding either grandiose or anticlimactic. But it's real in a way the mediated experiences never were. Because now there's no intermediary, no form between you and direct contact with the source. Michael reached this stage 8 months after stopping yoga. 8 months of guilt, confusion, and sitting in the void with no structure. And then one morning, sitting in silence with no technique, no intention, no practice, just being, he encountered something he'd been seeking through all those years of yoga, but never quite touched. Not a state, not an experience, not something that came and went, but a presence, a knowing, a direct contact with what he'd been projecting onto external practices his entire spiritual life. He said, "All those years I was trying to get somewhere through practice. I didn't realize I was already there. The practice kept me perpetually seeking what I already was." Deep dive into what becomes clear. When you reach this point of direct encounter, certain things become unmistakably clear, not as concepts you understand intellectually, but as lived reality you can't unfeel or unknow. Spiritual practice was intermediary. You realize that all the practices you've done, meditation techniques, yoga asanas, prayer forms, ritual structures, were training wheels. They were necessary. They served their purpose. They developed your capacity. But awakening doesn't require techniques. Awakening is the dissolution of the need for techniques. It's direct recognition of what's always been present beneath every practice you've ever done. The technique was the finger pointing at the moon. You spent years perfecting your pointing technique. Now you're looking directly at the moon, and the finger is irrelevant. Community provided belonging, but individuation's solitary. This is a hard truth. Spiritual communities are beautiful. They provide support, belonging, shared values, collective energy. They're essential for certain stages of the path. But individuation, becoming who you actually are rather than who the collective wants you to be, is ultimately a solitary journey. No community can walk it for you. No community can validate it for you. No community can even fully understand it, because your individual path is unique to your psyche. Jung was clear about this. Individuation often requires separation from the collective, including spiritual collectives. Not permanent isolation, but willingness to stand alone in your truth, even when it doesn't match the group's truth. Many spiritual communities, despite their talk of individual awakening, subtly or not so subtly pressure members toward conformity. Conform to the dress code, conform to the diet, conform to the beliefs, conform to the practices, conform to the teacher's path. But your path isn't your teacher's path. Your awakening isn't identical to the tradition's map. Your psyche has its own intelligence, its own timing, its own unfolding. When you're ready for direct encounter, the community's collective path becomes restrictive rather than supportive. Not because the community is wrong, but because you've individuated beyond needing collective validation. Teachers pointed the way, but you walk it alone. Your teachers were essential. They showed you possibilities you couldn't see on your own. They held space for your development. They transmitted wisdom you needed. But at a certain point, you realize they can't walk your path for you. They can't awaken for you. They can't give you direct encounter. You have to discover it yourself. Jung never wanted disciples. He actively discouraged people from becoming Jungians. He said, "Thank God I'm Jung and not a Jungian." He understood that genuine psychological development requires people to find their own path, not imitate his. The teacher who truly serves your awakening is the one who eventually says, "Now you have to leave me. Now you have to trust yourself more than you trust me. Now you have to discover what I cannot teach you." Michael's yoga teacher never said this. The tradition never encouraged this. The community never validated this. They all, in subtle ways, kept him dependent on the external structures. His psyche had to rip him away from those structures against his conscious will because they were preventing the next stage of development. Rituals channeled numinous energy, but now you contact it directly. Rituals are powerful. They create sacred space. They channel spiritual energy. They provide structure for experiences that are otherwise overwhelming and chaotic. But rituals are containers, not the content itself. They're forms that hold energy. And when your consciousness develops the capacity to hold that energy directly without the form, the ritual becomes unnecessary. You don't need to light the candles, burn the incense, speak the words, or perform the gestures to access the sacred. The sacred is here, now, always, without mediation. This doesn't mean rituals are bad or that you'll never use them again. It means they're optional rather than essential. They're one possible way to structure experience, not the only way. Michael still does yoga occasionally, but it's not his spiritual practice anymore. It's just movement. Sometimes enjoyable, sometimes not, but no longer carrying the weight of his spiritual seeking. The spiritual seeking dissolved, not because he found what he was seeking, but because he realized he was what he'd been seeking. Jung's teaching on Christ's symbol and direct experience. Jung spent considerable time analyzing the Christ symbol from a psychological perspective, and what he discovered is directly relevant to this stage of silent awakening. He wrote, "The Christ symbol is of the greatest importance for psychology insofar as it is perhaps the most highly developed and differentiated symbol of the self. The Christ figure represents the self, the integrated wholeness, the divine human unity, the individuated personality. For centuries, this symbol has carried projection for millions of people. People project onto Christ their own unrealized potential for wholeness, This projection serves a purpose. It shows you what's possible. It points toward integration, toward the union of opposites, toward the transcendent function. But Jung understood something crucial. The symbol must eventually give way to direct experience. He said, "What happens in the life of Christ happens always and everywhere. In the Christian archetype, all lives of this kind are prefigured and are expressed over and over again. But it is not a question of imitating the life of Christ, but of realizing that one's own life is expressed in Christ's life." Read that carefully. You're not imitating an external model. You're recognizing that the pattern Christ represents is happening in your own psyche. The death and resurrection, the descent and ascent, the crucifixion of the ego and emergence of the self. This is what happens during silent awakening when external spiritual forms fall away. The symbols you've been projecting onto are revealing themselves as maps of your own psyche. Christ, Buddha, Krishna, Muhammad, whatever symbols carried your spiritual projection, they're pointing toward direct experiences available in your own consciousness. You don't need to follow Christ. You need to become conscious of the Christ pattern unfolding in your own individuation process. You don't need to imitate Buddha. You need to awaken to the Buddha nature that's your own deepest reality. The external spiritual authorities and practices become unnecessary, not because they were false, but because they successfully pointed you toward what was always within. I need to share my own experience of this dissolution because it was one of the most painful and most liberating experiences of my awakening process. I was part of a meditation community for 7 years. These people were my family. We practiced together, studied together, celebrated together, supported each other through life's difficulties. The teacher was someone I deeply respected. The practice was genuinely transformative. My entire life was organized around this community. My social life, my identity, my sense of purpose, all of it was connected to being part of this Sangha. And then, about a year into my silent awakening, I started feeling what Michael felt: hollowness. The teachings that used to resonate deeply started sounding repetitive. The group practice that used to feel powerful started feeling performative. Even my relationship with the teacher, which had been one of genuine reverence, started feeling like unhealthy dependence. I fought this feeling for months. I thought I was in spiritual crisis. I thought my ego was sabotaging my practice. I thought I was being arrogant, thinking I didn't need the community or the teacher anymore. But the feeling persisted. And finally, sitting in silence one morning, I heard it clearly. It's time to leave, not with anger, not with judgment toward the community or the teacher, just completion. That chapter was finished. I left. And the guilt was excruciating. People in the community thought I was lost, regressing, caught in ego. Some were genuinely concerned for me. Some were subtly judgmental. The teacher was disappointed. They never said it directly, but I could feel it. I felt like I was abandoning my spiritual family, betraying my path, losing my way. But here's what I discovered. I wasn't losing my way. I was finding it. For 7 years, I'd been following someone else's map. A beautiful map, a helpful map, but someone else's map nonetheless. And my psyche was ready for me to stop following maps and start exploring directly. The 6 months after leaving were the void period. No community, no teacher, no structured practice, no validation from anyone that I was on the right path. Just me. Silence and uncertainty. And then direct encounter, not with something new, with what had always been there underneath all the practices, all the teachings, all the community support, my own self, my own direct connection to what Jung called the numinous. The community had been essential. The teacher had been exactly what I needed. The practices had done their work. But I'd reached a point where continuing with them would have prevented the next stage of my individuation. I'm grateful for those 7 years, and I'm grateful I had the courage to leave when it was time. Now let's look at your shadow around this, because it's revealing itself in your judgments about other people's spiritual practices. Do you find yourself dismissing people who are too attached to their spiritual practices, who seem overly devoted to their teachers or traditions, who can't seem to think for themselves spiritually? Or maybe the opposite. Do you judge people who've left their spiritual communities as uncommitted, as spiritual tourists who won't stick with anything, as arrogant in thinking they don't need teachers or traditions? Your judgment reveals your own unintegrated relationship with spiritual authority and structure. If you judge people for being too attached to external forms, you might be avoiding your own need for structure, devotion, and guidance. You might be premature in your independence, leaving before you've actually integrated what the forms have to teach. If you judge people for leaving their spiritual communities, you might be afraid of your own emerging independence. You might be staying in structures that you've outgrown because stepping into the void of direct experience is terrifying. Either way, what you cannot tolerate in others shows you what you need to integrate in yourself. The person who's genuinely moved beyond needing external spiritual forms doesn't judge people who still need them. They remember how essential those forms were. They have compassion for where people are in their journey, and the person who's genuinely devoted to their spiritual practice doesn't need to defend it by judging those who practice differently. Their practice is real for them, and that's enough. If you're judging, you're not integrated. Your judgment is your psyche's way of showing you where you still have work to do. I need to be completely clear about something. The void period feels like spiritual death because it is spiritual death. Not metaphorical death, not poetic death, actual death of the spiritually structured life you've been living. Everything that gave your spiritual seeking meaning, the practices, the community, the teacher, the goal dissolves, and you're left with nothing. No map, no method, no guarantee that anything will emerge on the other side. This is terrifying. This is the dark night of the soul that mystics have written about for centuries. This is what Jesus experienced in the desert, what Buddha experienced under the Bodhi tree, what every genuine awakening requires, the death of the spiritual seeker. Most people cannot tolerate this void. They abort the process. They return to old structures or grab onto new ones. They'll try different traditions, different teachers, different techniques, anything to fill the emptiness. But the void is the womb. Nothing new can be born if you keep filling it. Jung understood this. He called it the nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution, the necessary death that precedes rebirth. In alchemical terms, you have to dissolve before you can coagulate. You have to die before you can be reborn. The spiritual death feels like you're losing everything. You're losing your identity as a spiritual practitioner. You're losing your community and belonging. You're losing the practices that gave structure to your inner life. You're losing the goal that motivated your seeking. What you don't realize until you've crossed this threshold is that everything you're losing was preventing direct encounter. The identity, the community, the practices, the goal. They were all intermediaries. They were all, however, beautiful and beneficial in the way. On the other side of the void, you don't emerge with a new practice or a new tradition. You emerge as direct contact, as presence without mediation, as what you were seeking before you started seeking. Michael described it perfectly. I didn't find anything in the void. I just stopped looking. And when I stopped looking, I realized I was already what I'd been looking for. And here's what emerges from the void. Authentic spirituality that's completely unique to your psyche. Not a tradition you adopt, not a teacher you follow, not a practice you perfect, but a direct, ongoing, unmediated relationship with the numinous that's shaped by your unique psychological structure, your specific life experiences, your individual gifts and wounds. Your spirituality doesn't look like anyone else's because your psyche isn't like anyone else's. Maybe your spiritual practice becomes walking in silence. Maybe it becomes creative expression. Maybe it becomes simple presence with whatever's arising. Maybe it becomes engaged service. Maybe it becomes deep study. Maybe it becomes conscious relationship. There's no correct form. There's only authentic contact. Jung's own spiritual life was completely unique. He didn't follow any tradition. He integrated insights from multiple traditions, but wasn't bound by any of them. His spirituality emerged from his direct encounter with his own unconscious, his own dreams, his own active imagination. He said, "I am not a theologian or a philosopher, but an empiricist who describes and observes in a scientific spirit what he finds in the human psyche, including religion and its statements." This is the posture of authentic spirituality after the dissolution of conventional forms, empirical investigation of your own psyche, direct observation of what's actually happening in your inner life, rather than adherence to what should be happening according to some external map. You become your own authority, not in an arrogant way, in a responsible way. You can no longer outsource your spiritual truth to teachers or traditions. You have to know for yourself. You have to trust your own direct experience more than anyone else's teachings about experience. This is maturity. This is individuation. This is what Jung meant when he talked about becoming conscious. This is the seventh sign of silent awakening. Conventional spiritual practice loses its appeal. The rituals feel empty. The teachings feel repetitive. The community feels constricting. The teacher no longer has answers that satisfy, not because any of it was wrong, not because you're spiritually lost, but because you've reached a threshold where external forms must dissolve to make space for direct encounter. The path that brought you here cannot take you where you're going. The practices that opened the door cannot walk through it for you. The teachers who showed you the way cannot realize your individual truth. This dissolution is frightening. It feels like spiritual failure. It looks like regression to everyone around you who's still invested in the forms. But it's not failure, it's maturation. It's the psyche's intelligence guiding you from mediated to direct, from following to discovering, from seeking to being. Jung understood this completely. He knew that genuine individuation often requires breaking from collective spiritual forms, even forms that are deeply meaningful, because yourself, the organizing center of your unique psyche, has its own path, its own unfolding, its own wisdom, and that wisdom is speaking to you now through the emptiness of the practices that once sustained you. It's saying, you're ready for something more direct, something more authentic, something that emerges from your own depths rather than being adopted from external sources. Trust the dissolution. Stay in the void. Don't rush to fill the emptiness with new forms. What's waiting on the other side isn't a better practice or a truer tradition. It's direct, unmediated contact with what you've been seeking your entire life. But the dissolution of external spiritual forms isn't the only emergence happening during this stage of silent awakening. There's another channel opening up, one that's been dormant for most of your life. Deep in the silence, something wants to be created, not consumed, not learned, not achieved, created. From the void where external spiritual practices used to live, creative expression is beginning to emerge with an urgency you can't ignore and a compulsion you can't explain. Your psyche is finding its voice, and that voice speaks in images, in symbols, in forms that bypass the rational mind completely. The self is painting itself into reality, and you're about to become the brush,